grave concern about the mounting allegations of sexual violence and called for swift and rigorous investigations to ensure accountability as a central aspect of deterrence, prevention, and non-repetition. The failure to acknowledge and investigate past atrocities is the surest sign that violations will continue unabated. All the warning signs are flashing red, and yet essential civilian infrastructure has been reduced to rubble and ruin. Gender-based violence and reproductive health services are least available just when they are needed most. We do not need hard data for a scaled-up humanitarian response. We do not need hard data for all parties to ensure zero tolerance for sexual violence. The harrowing personal testimonies and pictures seen around the world, including of rape at gunpoint and rape in front of family members, are a call to action. The report before us today surfaces painful human stories, all of which cry out for justice and redress. In northern Ethiopia, a young woman was taken to an Eritrean Defense Forces camp where 27 soldiers raped her, as a result of which she contracted HIV. An elderly, visually impaired woman was shot by soldiers after being detained for 3 days while her daughter was raped by members of the Ethiopian National Defense Forces in an adjacent room. An adolescent boy was raped in Himora, who later committed suicide. There's also the case of a woman and 2 girls whose discarded bodies were found days after their kidnapping and rape by armed elements in the Central African Republic, where sexual violence has doubled over the past year, particularly against displaced populations who are at risk of being forgotten victims of a forgotten war. Likewise, the plight of over 900,000 Rohingya refugees in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh, has become a crisis within a crisis, following the military takeover of Myanmar by the Tatmadaw. This year's report includes the tragic case of 2 women subjected to gang rape by Tatmadaw soldiers in Chin State, resulting in unwanted pregnancies in both cases. There is also the case of a woman allegedly raped at gunpoint by an officer of the Puntland police force in Somalia, a context where abduction, rape, and forced marriage are rampant, while legislative reform to address these crimes has been stalled since 2018. In Colombia, cases of sexual violence committed against women, ex-combatants, and members of their families were also documented. In Afghanistan, professional women, including in the security sector, have been targeted for their work to address sexual violence, with a female police officer who was 8 months pregnant, brutally tortured and killed in Gore province. Thousands of civilians abducted by Daesh in Iraq and Syria between 2014 and 2017 remain in captivity, including victims of forced marriage and sexual slavery. In Yemen, harmful social norms exacerbated by 7 years of armed conflict can result in a victim being killed for reporting rape, which persists in detention facilities and displacement settings. In each of these contexts, we see the emboldening effects of impunity. Indeed, the gap between commitments and compliance, resolutions and reality is evident on every page of the annual report. Over the past year, sexual violence continued to be committed as a tactic of war, torture, terrorism, and political repression. The report covers 18 country situations and documents 3,293 UN-verified cases of conflict-related sexual violence committed in 2021, representing a significant increase of some 800 cases compared with 2020. Once again, the highest number of incidents was recorded in the Democratic Republic of the Congo with 1,016 cases. The vast majority of incidents targeted women and girls, 97%. 83 cases were recorded against men and boys, with the majority occurring in detention settings. 12 verified cases were found to target LGBTQI individuals. The report demonstrates how intersecting forms of inequality based on ethnic identity, political affiliation, age, disability, sexual orientation and gender identity, income, and migratory status increase the risk faced by diverse individuals in a context of historical power imbalances, which are structural and systemic. While the report conveys the severity of verified incidents, no report can capture the full scale and prevalence of this chronically underreported, historically hidden crime. Indeed, survivors continue to be silenced by trauma, pain, and despair, as well as by stigma, insecurity, and the paucity of service provision. There is a relationship between the individual silence and the official silence. Survivors cannot be expected to denounce what the state itself denies. When the perpetrators walk free, the survivors walk in fear, carrying the burden of ostracism and shame. The central insight of this year's report is the need to foster a protective environment that inhibits sexual violence in the first instance and enables safe reporting and response. These are not isolated incidents. They do not occur in a vacuum. Today, we know more than ever before about the security dynamics that cause these crimes to occur and recur, namely mass population displacement, collapsed rule of law, decimated infrastructure and institutions, rising violent extremism, and hostilities waged in proximity to civilian population centers. It is also starkly evident across the world that lawlessness and impunity are tantamount to license to rape. We are aware of the visible drivers, such as arms proliferation, and the invisible drivers, such as gender-based discrimination. We know the context in which sexual violence is concentrated, namely in displacement, detention, at checkpoints, on military bases, and in rural areas where women undertake livelihood activities. And we know that socioeconomically marginalized women in areas beyond the reach of law institutions are at greatest risk. What is this? What is this? May I continue, Mr. President?
Yes. I think if we could just request everyone to put their phones, I think that was an Amber Alert warning, but SRSG, please continue.
Thank you. Prosecution, Mr. President, is also a form of prevention and can help to convert the centuries-old culture of impunity for these crimes into a culture of deterrence. Whereas impunity normalizes violence, justice reinforces global norms. It is time to move from visibility to accountability and to ensure that today's documentation translates into tomorrow's prosecutions. The prohibition on sexual violence is clear and categorical, yet norms have no power unless they are known. Every member of this council can lead the way in reflecting that prohibition in their military manuals, international humanitarian law dissemination and training, codes of conduct, and military disciplinary measures at all levels of the chain of command. We have said for several years in this chamber that sexual violence is preventable, not inevitable. It is time now to make accountability inevitable. Survivors must be seen by their societies as the holders of rights that will be respected and enforced. And societies must realize that the only shame of rape is in committing, commanding, or condoning it. In 2021, four encouraging developments took place in terms of transitional justice. Firstly, in Guatemala, five former members of the paramilitary group, the Civil Self-Defense Patrols, were convicted and sentenced for crimes of sexual violence committed against indigenous Maya Achi women in the 1980s. Secondly, in Iraq, the Council of Representatives adopted the Yazidi Survivors Law, which provides support to victims of Daesh atrocities. Thirdly, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights issued a ruling that found the state responsible for violations of the rights of Colombian journalist Mrs. Ginette Bedoya Lima, following her two-decade quest for justice for abduction and sexual abuse. Yesterday, I was pleased to announce Mrs. Bedoya's appointment as one of my mandate's global champions for the prevention of conflict-related sexual violence. Fourth, under the auspices of universal jurisdiction, a former official of the Syrian General Intelligence Service, Anwar R., was convicted by the higher regional court in Koblenz, Germany, for crimes against humanity, including sexual violence committed in 2011 and 2012. Each year, we report 3 or 4 landmark judgments against the backdrop of thousands of UN verified cases that meet the elements of international crimes. Accordingly, I regret to note that the few emblematic cases of justice delivered are still the exception that prove the rule of justice denied. In June 2021, my office launched model legislative provisions and guidance on the investigation and prosecution of conflict-related sexual violence, which aims to ensure that the national legislation comprehensively criminalizes all forms of sexual violence and protects all individuals at risk. This guidance supports implementation of Security Council Resolution 2467 of 2019, which calls on member states to strengthen legislation and enhance investigation and prosecution of sexual violence in order to deliver justice that is accessible, empowering, and ultimately transformative in line with the survivor-centered approach. Yet, accountability processes, while critical, are no substitute for compliance with international norms in the first instance. This year's report lists 49 parties credibly suspected of committing or being responsible for patterns of sexual violence in situations of the agenda of the Council. Over 70% are persistent perpetrators, having appeared in the list for 5 or more years without taking remedial or corrective action. It is critical, Mr. President, to cohere the practice of listing suspected perpetrators and the practice of imposing targeted and graduated measures by sanctions committees to improve compliance. Leveraging the credible threat of sanctions can change the calculation of parties to conflict that operate on the assumption that rape is cost-free or even profitable in the political economy of war, in which women and girls are trafficked, traded, and sold. 8 sanctions regimes now include sexual violence as part of their designation criteria. In 2021, the 1970 Committee on Libya listed the de facto manager of the notorious al-Nasser detention center for abuses, including sexual violence. Excellencies, distinguished members of the Security Council, in terms of the way forward, the report recommends targeted action to reinforce structural prevention through political and diplomatic engagements to address sexual violence in ceasefire and peace agreements, the use of early warning indicators of sexual violence to inform monitoring, threat analysis, and early response, curtailing the flow of small arms and light weapons, gender-responsive justice and security sector reform, including vetting, training, codes of conduct, zero tolerance policies, and effective prosecutions, amplifying the voices of survivors and affected communities, and supporting women's human rights defenders as well as victims and witnesses. Justice, peace, and security are inextricably linked. Collaboration between this council and the Peace Building Commission can advance gender responsive accountability and reconciliation processes which address crimes of sexual violence as part of the consolidation of peace. We must deliver justice, not just law, in communities as well as courtrooms, and ensure that reparations reach survivors to help them rebuild shattered lives and livelihoods. It is critical that member states reinforce the architecture established by this council through Resolution 1888, including the team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence in conflict that works to strengthen institutional safeguards against impunity, the interagency coordination network, UN Action Against Sexual Violence in Conflict, and women's protection advisors, whose timely deployment to the field is vital for timely reporting and response. We must marshal a level of resolve and resources equal to the scale of the challenge, including by replenishing the conflict-related sexual violence multi-partner trust fund that supports our work. Our special report on women and girls who become pregnant as a result of sexual violence in conflict and children born of sexual violence in conflict, circulated in January, also sets out a platform of legal, policy, and operational recommendations, including reforming discriminatory nationality laws and practices. I look forward to the special report being debated by the Council later this year. Excellencies, the UN Charter was born of war to chart the path to peace. No amount of protection or assistance is a substitute for peace. As a wise woman once said, you can no more win a war than an earthquake. Wars are indeed unwinnable, and yet their social and economic aftershocks affect us all. Throughout history, human progress has been interrupted by plagues, wars, and authoritarian rule. Issues we thought had been consigned to the ash heap of history remain in our daily headlines. We cannot choose the times we live in. We can only choose how we respond. We must not rest until every survivor, every civilian can sleep under the cover of justice. There is no place in the modern world for gender apartheid, for strong men in place of strong institutions, or for medieval wars of looting, pillage, and rape. Women's rights are not Western rights. They are human rights, and they are universal in times of war and peace. Prevention is the best form of protection, including the prevention of conflict itself. We must rise to the challenge of our times. Inaction is not an option. Thank you, Mr. President.
I wish to thank Ms. Pramila Patten for a very extensive and detailed report. And if I could just make a request for my role as chair of this particular meeting, if you could please ensure this is a very important subject, and the testimonies, particularly from some of our survivors, and in accordance with due respect, I would ask you once again to please check your phones so that we can then proceed with the proceedings. With that, it's my great honor to now give the floor to Ms. Nadia Murad. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you as well to Ambassador Woodward and to the United Kingdom for organizing this important debate as one of your signature events and for inviting me to brief today. Ladies, gentlemen, and dear friends, we are gathered at a moment of global instability, a moment shaped by pandemic, war, and a climate crisis. In times like this, issues that affect women and girls, issues like conflict-related sexual violence, tend to be pushed aside, as though they are somehow secondary to the real issues. But the truth is, these are precisely the moments when protecting, supporting, and investing in women and girls should be urgent priorities. For every setback our societies face, women and girls are forced 10 steps back. This is particularly true in times of conflict. History shows that whenever armed conflict erupts anywhere in the world, rape and brutality follow. We are seeing this in Ukraine as we speak, with reports of sexual violence that should alarm us all. Sexual violence is not a side effect of conflict. It is a tactic of war as old as time. Groups like ISIS understand the destabilizing effect of gender-based violence, and so must we. ISIS began targeting my Yazidi community in 2014. Thousands of Yazidis were massacred. Others fled on foot, facing thirst, starvation, and blistering temperatures. In addition to the murders, ISIS captured more than 6,000 Yazidi women and children. Women and girls like me, my nieces, and my sisters were sold and raped. Those of us who survived were considered lucky. But the nightmare continues even now, 8 years later, for more than 2,800 women and children who are still living in captivity and sexual violence at the hands of ISIS. We are here today to discuss accountability, not only in the aftermath of conflict-related sexual violence, but importantly as a tool to prevent such violence from occurring in the first place. In particular, there is three aspects of accountability I would like to highlight: justice, support for survivors, and a commitment to gender equity in the long term. The pursuit of justice is one of the most visible forms of accountability. Last year, a German court convicted an ISIS member of genocide. It was the first time this had ever happened anywhere in the world. This historic verdict is an important step. But standing before you today, my question is, what next? ISIS led a systemic campaign of sexual violence to destroy Yazidi women and the Yazidi community. The United Nations has condemned their actions as genocide. UNITAD has collected reams of evidence documenting the atrocities ISIS committed against women and girls. And other terrorist groups and oppressive regimes have watched as ISIS members openly brag about enslaving Yazidi women and girls while facing few, if any, consequences on the world stage. As survivors of sexual violence, it is not easy for us to tell our stories, but we do it to prevent what happened to us from happening to others. We are called brave, but the courage we really want to see is from leaders in a position to do something, whether they are heads of state, member states here at the UN, or corporate leaders. We need more than moral outrage. We need action. To those of you assembled in this chamber, now is your moment to put ISIS on trials for genocide and sexual violence. Send the case to the International Criminal Court or establish a hybrid court by treaty to prosecute ISIS crimes. In the meantime, other nations should follow Germany's example and use the principle of universal jurisdiction to try war criminals for the atrocities they commit, including sexual violence. These trials must proceed with transparency for survivors who deserve their day in court. What message it will send if violent perpetrators of sexual violence continue to enjoy immunity? If you want to establish deterrence, if you want to assure Yazidi women and survivors everywhere that you stand with us, do not delay justice anymore. We have the evidence. All we need is the political will. Accountability means that those who perpetrate violence should face consequences for their actions. But it cannot stop there. Victims are not to blame for sexual violence. Yet, too often we are left to piece our lives back together on our own, abandoned by the governments and the international communities that felt in their mandate to protect the basic human rights of all people. Survivors need solidarity and tangible support to empower them and provide a path to recovery. Reparations and recognition are an essential part of justice. That is why I have co-founded the Global Survivors Fund with my friend and colleague, Dr. Dennis Mukwege, to provide interim reparations to survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. After all, to survivors, reparations are not some theoretical idea or a topic for legal debate. They are the difference between going hungry and having enough food to put on the table, between sustaining lifelong injuries and accessing reproductive health care, between being cast out of our communities and being able to put a roof over our heads. Through this project, we want survivors to know that we stand with them and they are not alone. 8 years after ISIS genocide, survivors who returned to Sinjar are still struggling to recover in the face of political disputes between Baghdad and Erbil, with militia groups vying for control of our homeland. The UN Security Council should send a special envoy to end the suffering of Yazidis in Iraq. Member states have a moral responsibility not to abandon genocide survivors. This brings me to my third point. Every time we see a new conflict, there is an outpouring of thoughts and prayer. But as I know from personal experience, a few days or even a week in the news cycle does nothing to address the systemic challenges women face. This is true from Iraq to Ethiopia, to the Democratic Republic of Congo, to Ukraine, to conflict zones everywhere. It is not enough to talk about accountability and prevention in times of crisis. We need long-term commitments to advancing global gender equity, because gender equity is key to democracy. That means combating gender bias and stereotypes everywhere they occur, in homes and families, as well as in our education system. And it means recognizing that what is true in times of conflict is true in times of peace. If we want strong, stable communities, we must listen to women. To be very clear, when I say listen to women, I do not mean this in some abstract way. I mean that policymakers should leave the halls of power and go out into affected communities and ask women what they need. One solution will not work for everyone. Throughout the world, different socioeconomic and political circumstances impact women's rights. Compounding factors such as race, religion, class, and access to healthcare, education, and employment require different solutions. Survivors know best what they need to heal and recover, so why not ask them? At Nadia's initiative, the organization I founded, we see every day that the most effective work is community-led, survivor-centered, and takes a holistic approach. The work that is being done to help survivors must be done hand in hand with them. It is not just the act of listening that matters. How you listen, the way you communicate with survivors, and what you do with the information you collect. All of these things matter too. Documenting sexual violence is crucial for accountability and prevention. But too often, survivors who speak out face shame, stigma, and lack of transparency about how our testimonies will or will not be used, or the likely outcomes. That is why I look forward to joining Lord Ahmed tomorrow to officially announce the Murad Code, a set of guidelines intended to change norms around how journalists, investigators, and anyone tasked with documenting and investigating conflict-related sexual violence interacts with survivors. These guidelines were shaped by feedback from survivors around the globe and aim to promote greater respect, understanding, transparency, and healing. In conclusion, accountability can be a crucial component of prevention, but only if it includes meaningful justice. The services and support survivors need, and the ultimate goal of advancing global gender equity. Each of you in this room has the power to make this a reality, only if you choose to act. Everywhere I go, I meet survivors of sexual violence who are bravely telling their stories in the face of stigma, shame, and even physical danger. If women who have suffered such immense loss and incredible pain can find the strength to not only rebuild our lives, but help our families, communities, and entire countries, surely the rest of the world can find the strength to take meaningful steps to end sexual violence in conflict. As survivors, we look to you, the leaders in this room, to act with the same courage we have shown. Survivors do not want pity. We want justice. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I thank, on behalf of all of us, Ms. Nadia Murad for her deep insights and her continuing courage and strength on this important issue. Thank you, Ms. Murad, for your briefing. It's now my honor to invite and give the floor to Ms. Mariana Karakutli. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Mr. President, Excellencies, civil society colleagues. My name is Mariana Karkutli, and I'm a co-founder of Huquqiyat, a membership-based organization of women lawyers and legal practitioners advocating for accountability in Syria. Thank you for the opportunity to deliver this statement today. Mr. President, let me start by saying that what drove me to study law was not love of the law, but the experience of injustice. While studying law under a dictatorship did not teach me much, witnessing women in Syria fighting for their rights did. Accountability, the theme of this open debate, is a difficult word to say in the Syrian context. We have experienced all sorts of atrocities for over a decade, with more than 350,000 people killed, tens of thousands arbitrarily detained or disappeared, nearly 13 million displaced, and another 14 million in need of humanitarian assistance. Parties to the conflict have violated international human rights and humanitarian law, used chemical weapons, and committed acts that amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. Government forces and armed groups continue to murder, torture, and use sexual and gender-based violence against civilians as a matter of policy. Yet, despite discussing Syria for more than a decade, this council has failed to take actions to hold perpetrators accountable. The Syrian government has systematically violated not only international law, but many of the Security Council's own resolutions. Meanwhile, members of this council has blocked urgent actions on Syria, shielded the Syrian regime from accountability, and vetoed resolutions on humanitarian assistance and investigating the use of chemical weapons against civilians 16 times. My statement today will focus on three issues: the use of sexual violence against women, entrenched gender discrimination in Syria, and next steps from the international community to ensure accountability. As documented by the UN Commission of Inquiry on Syria, sexual and gender-based violence has been used against civilians during ground operations, at checkpoints, and in detention across the country since 2011, primarily by government forces and associated militia, but also other armed groups. It has been called a devastating and pervasive feature of the Syrian conflict and part of a widespread and systematic attack against civilians, amounting to crimes against humanity. This violence continues as we speak. I have worked as an independent investigator with the support of the Center for Justice and Accountability since 2020 on case building against members of the Assad regime responsible for crimes against civilians. To date, we have documented 54 testimonies, including of survivors of sexual violence. These are just some of the hundreds that have been documented out of tens of thousands of survivors. Over the last decade, at least 150,000 people in Syria are estimated to have been arbitrarily arrested, detained, or disappeared. At least 9,700 women still are. These women, lawyers, journalists, activists, and others have been detained for opposing the regime, or often to punish or threaten male relatives who have. In places of detention, sexual violence is used to humiliate them, to punish them for rebelling, and to force confessions. Women in detention have been subject to all kinds of sexual violence, including rape, torture, sexual harassment, electric shocks directed at genital areas, intimate searches, forced abortions, and forced nudity. Survivors of rape and sexual violence in detention, estimated to number in the thousands, have largely been unable to report these crimes for fear of marginalization or further retaliation. Discrimination and violence against women and girls who have been detained or who have faced sexual violence has resulted in abandonment, divorce, so-called honor killings, and suicide. The Syrian regime has taken advantage of this. They knew that by targeting women in this way, they were in fact targeting their communities as a whole. This is why arresting and detaining women, leaving their families with no information about their fate, has been a key tool used to suppress Syrian dissent since 2011. The systematic occurrence of these crimes across the country provides reasonable grounds to assert that the regime has weaponized gender-based violence as a matter of state policy. The Syrian regime's actions have been possible because of a corrupt legal system and entrenched discrimination against women and girls in Syria, which impacts their access to housing, land, property rights, custody of their children, as well as their protection. For instance, laws in Syria do not criminalize sexual or gender-based violence against women or marital rape. Syrian women cannot pass their nationality to their children, and even where laws have changed, social practices have not. Furthermore, sexual and gender-based violence against women does not end inside Syria, but continues in the camps, settlements, and cities throughout the region, where millions of Syrian refugees face discrimination, poverty, and lack of access to healthcare and education, all while experiencing pressure to return to a country that is not yet safe. Syrians are desperate for justice after more than a decade of war. Domestic accountability is impossible as long as the Assad regime remains in power. The universal jurisdiction cases currently being pursued against suspects for crimes committed in Syria, while positive, have also had limits, including how fear of retaliation for reporting to local authorities and the trauma and stigmatization of survivors of sexual violence impact the ability and willingness of victims to come forward. Mr. President, Syrians can no longer wait for justice. We encourage all UN member states to continue to pursue accountability under universal jurisdiction. But we are also looking to you, the Security Council, for help by referring the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court. Despite 14 years of this Council's condemnation of the use of sexual violence in conflict, impunity prevails, not only in Syria, but in many other conflicts on this Council's agenda. This is often not because sexual violence has been inadequately criminalized or because perpetrators are unknown, but due to a lack of political courage. The Security Council must call on the Syrian government to respect international law, end attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure, and ensure an immediate, permanent nationwide ceasefire. Immediately end torture, inhumane treatment, and sexual violence, including in places of arrest and detention. Release all arbitrarily detained persons. Allow unconditional access to all places of detention by international humanitarian organizations. Release the names, status, and locations of all detainees and a timetable of their release. To you, the Security Council, member states, and the UN, I urge you to refer the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court. Adopt a resolution on the situation of detainees and missing persons that underlines the Syrian government's obligations under international law and reflects the priorities outlined by associations representing victims, survivors, and their families, such as the Truth and Justice Charter, including support for creation of a mechanism to clarify the fate of missing persons and supporting their families. Investigate and prosecute all perpetrators of sexual violence and ensure women's rights are at the core of all accountability efforts. Ensure women's full, equal, and meaningful participation in all ongoing and future political, peace, or reconciliation processes. Prioritize a survivor-centered and right-based approach to prevention and mitigation of gender-based violence. Ensure that the Special Envoy for Syria prioritizes human rights and international humanitarian law, including arbitrary detention, enforced disappearance, torture, and gender-based violence in political discussions. That he convenes Syrian civil society on how to address these issues and regularly briefs the Security Councils on these efforts. Renew the cross-border mechanism for at least 12 months and reauthorize access via all original crossing points. Cross-border access is an indispensable lifeline for millions of people in Syria, the majority of whom are women and children. Pressure arms exporting countries to stop arms proliferation and prevent the use of weapons against all civilians. When people in Syria watch conflicts rage in Ukraine and other parts of the world, today, we are reminded of our own suffering and the abject failure of this body to stop the violence. I join my voice with those of millions of girls and women from Syria who are not here with me today and call on you to take action. There can be no peace without justice. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Karkutli for a very powerful statement. I now give the floor to Ms. Helena Berhanu. The floor is yours.
Mr. President, distinguished representatives of member states, and honored attendees, thank you for allowing me to bring the stories of Ethiopian women to the chamber of the Security Council. I speak to you today as an Ethiopian woman, one who has heard these testimonies and seen this endured firsthand in Tigray, one who carries the guilt of survival in silence. Today, I hope to do justice to the experience of millions of Ethiopian women who've suffered in this war. In this briefing, I'll focus on 6 points in relation to conflict-related sexual violence in Ethiopia since the war began in Tigray in November 2020 and expanded to neighboring regions of Amhara and Afar. These points are directly drawn from human rights investigations and reports that have been made public, as well as on my own visits to the region. First, rape has been perpetrated systematically and used as a tactic of war. It is framed as a means of reprisal and leveraged as a bonding tool for members of allied military forces. When the war first started, Blaine, a 21-year-old waitress from Badime, along with 30 other Tigrayan women, was held against her will and subjected to sexual slavery, starvation, and gang rape by a group of Eritrean Ethiopian soldiers who took turns with her. I documented many other stories like Blaine's during multiple visits to the region of Tigray before June 2021. Sexual violence was used to terrorize communities as a bonding tool amongst allied Eritrean Defense Forces, Ethiopian National Defense Force, Amhara Regional Militia, and special forces through the shared experiences of exploiting women's bodies. The consistency across victims' accounts show that these crimes were committed intentionally with a degree of organization and planning. Second, sexual violence is ethnically motivated. A Tigrayan woman was fleeing the conflict zone with her children. Along the way, she encountered the Amhara militia from her family, gang raped her, and inserted a hot metal rod into her uterus. They declared, a Tigrayan should never give birth. Similar incidents of rape with claims of cleansing Tigrayan blood and mutilating women's bodies to prevent the birth of more generations of Tigrayans have been extensively covered by different human rights reports. And third, sexual violence is used to humiliate survivors and their communities. Sexual violence has often been perpetrated in front of family members. An Amhara woman was beaten and raped in the presence of her husband and a child by 2 Tigrayan force members. She and her children witnessed her husband being killed as she tried to stop the assault. Men and boys were also sexually assaulted. The Ethiopian Human Rights Commission found in Samra, town of Tigray, 600 men and boys were stripped and forcibly paraded, some completely naked, while Eritrean female soldiers mocked them and took pictures. And fourth, women with disabilities and other vulnerable communities have been at particular risk during this conflict. Many women with disabilities were specifically targeted in the region of Tigray, as they were presumed to be fighters of the previous war. Girls, elderly women, and women belonging to minority and indigenous communities also face higher risks. The lack of access to the region for independent human rights monitoring has made it difficult to document the impact of the conflict in minority communities, and especially those living in disputed areas on the Eritrean border, such as Europe and Kunama and Tigray. And fifth, the conflict in northern Ethiopia and the effective siege of the Tigray region in particular has undermined women's rights, including access to reproductive health care and psychosocial support, exacerbating the impacts of sexual violence. In May 2021, I visited a shelter supported by Mekelle University in Tigray, where many lactating mothers and their infants had taken refuge. These women, some of whom had survived sexual assault while being pregnant, could not access timely sexual and reproductive care, owed mainly to widespread destruction of medical facilities and limited deliveries of aid due to the government blockade of the region. The conflict in northern Ethiopia has increased women's vulnerabilities irrespective of their ethnicity. I carry with me the story of Khadija, a 9-month pregnant woman from Afar who fled the shelling of Abala town by Tigrayan Defense Forces with her 5 children and elderly mother. She gave birth under a tree after working for 9 days, 2 of which while in labor. In a country with one of the highest maternal mortality rates globally and lack of infrastructure, specifically in pastoral communities and areas, the conflict immediately puts the lives of many Tibetan women in grave danger. Lack of access to psychosocial support services also means that the mental health of survivors hangs in the balance. Many have already died by suicide. The story of a 50-year-old Amhara woman from Shawa Robit in central Ethiopia was gang raped by Tigrayan fighters in the presence of her son in the next room and later died of suicide, highlights how tragic the situation is. Initial reports also indicate disproportionate rates of suicide amongst internally displaced persons across different parts of Tigray. And amid a total internet and telecom blackout, I fear the extent of the trauma felt by the community remains unknown. And 6, while cases of sexual violence from Tigray, Afar, and Amhara have attracted international attention, women from other communities across Ethiopia, specifically from that of the Oromo, Gumuz, Konso, Kamant, and Somali, specifically Ogaden, continue to experience conflict-related sexual violence, including by state forces, without any attention from the international community. Mr. President, members of the Council, the central theme of today's open debate is accountability for sexual violence. Security Council Resolution 2467 recalls the critical role of national investigations. The Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and UN Office for Human Rights were able to conduct a joint investigation, which was limited in scope and analysis. But unfortunately, and more broadly, we have witnessed deliberate delays of investigation, withholding of information, failings of the justice system, and destruction of evidence, including statistical records, and harassment and detention of journalists by the Ethiopian state and allied parties to the conflict. As we've seen in other contexts and in the spilling of this war into the broader northern region, lack of accountability and justice for past crimes continue to fuel a sense of grievances that drives a vicious cycle of retaliatory attacks. Based on the trends and the stories that I just highlighted, I would like to offer the following recommendations to the members of the Security Council. First, use your platform to demand that efforts to document, investigate, and prevent sexual violence and conflicts are survivor-centered and conducted in a dignified, safe, and confidential manner. As part of the pursuit of justice for survivors, the Security Council should also champion the work of the recently established International Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia, including by urging all parties to the conflict to fully cooperate and provide unimpeded access to the Commission. And second, the Council should demand that all parties ensure full and safe humanitarian access to Tigray and other areas of conflict, and ensure that humanitarian aid prioritizes the needs of survivors. This includes comprehensive sexual and reproductive health care and addressing stigma. Service providers must also continue to adhere to core humanitarian standards, including interagency standing committee guidelines on gender-based violence and mental health and psychosocial support. And finally, I call on the A3, the 3 African countries in the Security Council, who can be counted as some of the strongest voices of women, peace and security in this chamber. I urge them to work here and in the African Union through its Peace and Security Council, which has the mandate to request a proactive intervention from the AU Special Envoy on Women, Peace and Security, and to take a harder look at the prevailing view that supporting investigations of conflict-related sexual violence in Ethiopia could somehow derail the proposed reform agenda of the current government. Excellencies, this war has been so devastating to witness. First, because of the sheer scale of human suffering, and second, because many Ethiopians defended this violence in the name of patriotism. But my patriotism, my political loyalty, and my allegiance lie exclusively and firmly with Ethiopian women. And I thank you for inviting one of them to speak to you today.
I thank Ms. Berhanu again for a very powerful testimony and statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the United Kingdom.
Yes.
May I begin by thanking you, Special Representative Pramila Patten, in the relationship and the strength of the relationship between the United Kingdom and your office is something we hold very dear, and we welcome the continued coordination and strength of the work we're doing on this important agenda. To our brave activists, Mariana Kirkukli and Helena Berhanu, for your stark insights and also for your practical recommendations of the responsibilities and also the importance of action from us, the United Nations Security Council. And of course, to you, Nadia Murad, your determination, your courage, your example has at its heart a real willpower to build a world for survivors. Simply put, it's an inspiration for me, and I know I speak for every member of the Security Council. And your testimony today is again reflective of that central objective that we all share. Yet today, as we've heard again from the very powerful testimonies and the report of SRSG Patten, we continue to see disturbing reports. Disturbing reports emerging yet again of rape and sexual violence from Ukraine. And we are now once again reminded that when conflict erupts, sexual violence soon follows. As we've heard in northern Ethiopia, Syria, and Ukraine, we have witnessed the devastating effects on communities, on families, and especially on women and girls. It is important we come together and stand for these courageous survivors, not just to provide hope, but to provide action and ultimately justice. It is clear that impunity continues to be the norm for perpetrators. It should be an exception, and we must strive for that. And frankly put, the fact here we are that this is happening, and let us reflect on that, in the year 2022 is not just unacceptable, it is utterly shocking. And therefore we must strive to do more collectively to end the violence and ultimately, as we heard from each of the very powerful statements, deliver justice and accountability for survivors. We need to ensure that survivors can safely record their experiences in a way that strengthens the pursuit of justice. That is an important first, yet pivotal and crucial step towards accountability. However, as we've heard from Nadia Murad's powerful testimony, this is far from a reality for many survivors around the world. And frankly put, we must ask the question of ourselves, why? Why have we failed to protect? Why have we failed in our collective duty to put survivors first? Despite numerous guidance for those collecting information and evidence from survivors and witnesses, mistakes, frankly, continue to be made. Mistakes, not through any bad intent, yet mistakes which can allow the wheels of justice to slow and indeed destroy lives. Too many survivors are not told about what their options are or given the time and space to make their own choices about how their testimonies are best used. Too many survivors continue to face unnecessary re-interviewing. 27 times. Reflect on that figure, colleagues, 27 times, as one courageous survivor told me they had to give an interview. Interviews are being interrupted, they're being overheard. And by that, the impact of those testimonies is diluted, and they do not meet the threshold which too often is put forward as the reason why prosecutions cannot take place. The consequences can be devastating, soul-destroying, ending all hope. Simply put, it is unacceptable. Survivors are being re-traumatized time and time again, and work to deliver justice and accountability is being undermined. So therefore, it is vital that we end these harmful practices and put survivors' rights at the very heart of the evidence gathering. And therefore, I'm greatly humbled, as we heard from Nadia Murad, to join Nadia's initiative and the Institute for the International Criminal Investigations in releasing the Murad Code today. Firstly, I turn to you, Nadia. Thank you. You and I have known each other many years. You inspire me, and your courage is a powerful example to us all, as we've heard again today. And the Murad Code, the code to which you have so kindly lent your name, is a code of conduct. It is a code of conduct for the collection of information and evidence from survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. Importantly, as we've heard from all the contributions, as we've heard from SRSG Patton, it has been shaped by survivors. Survivors must be at the heart of the solutions we seek. But also, it's importantly brought together government, international organizations, and civil society. Because it is our collective responsibility to place survivors' needs at the very heart of our work. Therefore, I urge everyone involved in documenting and investigating conflict-related sexual violence, follow the Murad Code. In fact, go further, I would say. To my mind, it should become the very gold standard for any NGO, for any government agency, human rights institution, civil society group working in the field. Putting survivors first and at the center of investigations should not be an option. It should be done by everyone, everywhere. But our collective efforts cannot stop there. This year, we're exploring all options to strengthen international action, including an international convention as proposed by our Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss. And today, I'm also pleased to announce that from the 28th to the 30th of November, we will also host an international conference on this very issue, on preventing sexual violence in conflict, marking 10 years since we launched that very initiative. We will also, importantly, continue to bring faith and belief leaders together in support of survivors through the Declaration of Humanity. It cannot be right. Groups such as Daesh and others who use the veil of religion erroneously and perversely to somehow justify their abhorrent crimes and actions. Faith leaders are and continue to stand up to say very clearly, not in the name of our religion and not in the name of any faith or belief across the world. We will also make further progress to enhance the rights and well-being of children born of sexual violence and rape. I was honored to announce a call to action last November, but let's put that into perspective. A child born of such a crime, they should be given compassion. Instead, they are stigmatized. They are given rejection. That has to change at all levels. And we will also respond more robustly to reports of sexual violence in conflict, wherever, whenever they occur. We've just heard from Helena just now about the distressing situation in Ethiopia, the nature and scale of reports of sexual violence that have come out of Tigray, Amhara, and Afar are deeply, deeply disturbing. Yet many communities, as we've heard from that very testimony, remain cut off from communications and therefore unable to tell their story, seek the hope and indeed the support they need. And that is why it was important to us today, the United Kingdom, and I thank our ambassador and her team in this regard, to invite the first Ethiopian civil society representative to brief this Security Council on the situation in northern Ethiopia. And what's more, to hear directly from you, Helena, an Ethiopian woman who has been integral to feminist youth movements and who has recently worked with communities across the country who have been affected by conflict-related sexual violence. The United Kingdom government has committed more than £7 million to support survivors in northern Ethiopia and improve national accountability systems. And we will also continue to work to provide expertise to build capacity to hold perpetrators to account. And I welcome in this respect, the gauntlet was thrown down, but from our colleagues from the African Union, I pay tribute to the African Union's leadership on conflict-related sexual violence. 30 African countries now have a national action plan on women, peace and security, providing the very essential framework for addressing this issue and women's political participation in conflict-affected contexts. It's essential. Mariana, again, made that point. We have, within the UN framework, SRSG Patton and I discussed this, we have within the UN family incredible mediation networks of women. We need to ensure that expertise, those insights are deployed directly, not just in resolving conflicts, but in actually building sustainable peace. Sadly, again, we've heard from Mariana of how rape is being used and continues to be used to destroy the lives of many Syrian women and girls by various parties to the conflict. And the United Kingdom continues to support and provide support in that area. £4 million through its Conflict Stability and Security Fund has been used in response to that crisis. We've also strengthened the medical documentation of attacks in accordance with international standards and improved support services for survivors. And I am absolutely convinced that the Marab Code will be an important contribution to enhance that collection of evidence. I was also pleased to see the first conviction for conflict-related sexual violence in Syria delivered in Koblenz in January. Let me assure you, as we look around the world, the United Kingdom will also continue to support Afghan women who face some of the highest rates of violence in the world and are watching the progress made in recent decades unravel in front of their eyes. And let us also send a very clear message to those who seek to suppress women's rights, who seek to suppress the rights of education for girls. And yes, that is a message clearly for the Taliban to hear. Islam as a religion based itself on equality for girls and rights for women. Islam is clear. Are you? Empower girls, educate girls, empower women. The evidence is in front of you. Societies prosper, nations progress. We are also pushing to integrate services for all survivors of gender-based violence, including sexual violence, into Afghan healthcare provision. And that's being informed directly by the people who know best. Many leaders, Afghan women leaders, who are helping us on this important agenda. We are also working with the International Rescue Committee, the UN Population Fund, and others on programs to protect women and girls and provide access to gender-based violence services. Colleagues, members of the Security Council, we are collectively shocked at the abhorrent testimonies we hear in every conflict. But today, as we sit here, the abhorrent testimonies which are emerging from Ukraine. The reports of rape and sexual violence committed by Russian armed forces must be properly investigated. And that is why the United Kingdom has worked with partners to refer the situation in Ukraine to the International Criminal Court, to establish a commission of inquiry through the UN Human Rights Council, and with the support directly of Ukraine, to establish an OSCE mission of experts. In March, we announced an additional £1 million in funding for the ICC to help uncover evidence of war crimes. And let me put it simply and starkly. Sexual violence, rape, it's a vile, vile stain on humanity. Wherever it occurs, whoever the perpetrators, it is our collective moral duty. Indeed, it is our absolute obligation to work together, to help survivors, and do all we can to stamp it out. And as Nadia said, we must work together to provide the routes and avenues to see justice for survivors. To perpetrators, we must send a very clear message. A clear message not just from the Security Council, but every person in every society must be determined to send that same unequivocal message in all its clarity. You will be found. You will face justice. You will be held to account. And finally, to the survivors, to those who are here and the courageous survivors around the world, thank you. Thank you for the hope that you provide in the face of such challenge, in the face of unimaginable consequences you have faced. Thank you for your courage and conviction to carry on. Sexual violence is not just a crime against you, it's a crime against our common and shared humanity. We stand for you, and we will always stand with you. Thank you. I now resume my function as President of the Council, and I give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Linda Thomas-Greenfield, Permanent Representative of the United States and member of President Biden's cabinet. Your Excellency.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you so much for convening this very important discussion today. I also want to thank Special Representative Patton for your remarks. The United States is proud to support the important work of the SRSG's office. And most of all, thank you to the three briefers. Thank you for sharing your powerful stories, your courage and your strength as an inspiration to all of us. As we all know, sexual violence is a horrific and deliberate tactic in conflict. It is used to terrorize, to destabilize, to break communities and people down. Its impact ripple out far beyond survivors, and it fuels instability. Unfortunately, this unspeakable practice is not new. I was recalling as you all spoke in the early 90s, attending meetings with Somali women who were victims of violence in Somalia and hearing their horrific stories of rape and their plea to all of us to support them. And here we are today, hearing those same pleas from all of you. The same acts of violence are still being committed around the world today. And women like those Somali women that I spoke to in the 1990s are sitting here listening at us today. On Monday, we outlined the threats to women and girls in Ukraine from Russia's brutal and unprovoked war. And we cannot forget or look away from the way rape and sexual violence have been used as a weapon of war in Ethiopia and Syria and other conflicts around the world. This council has spent a great deal of time discussing these issues, noting them with great concern. Well, now it's time for us to act. As we heard today, expressions of concern are not enough. First, we and all governments need to hold perpetrators accountable. We must do more as a global community to actually implement the international commitments we've all agreed to, as Ms. Patton said to us today. Governments, instead of denying these acts, must acknowledge them and they must address them. They have to stop intimidating victims, silencing their voices, silencing those who raise concern and advocate for them, and hold those responsible accountable. We must explore ways to use the diplomatic tools we have as both individual member states and as a collective to do everything we can to ensure perpetrators do not get away with these acts of conflict-related sexual violence. And that means strengthening quality, ethical, and effective documentation efforts. We caution against any action that would duplicate or dilute the efficacy of our existing Security Council mandates and legal frameworks. We have the tools we need. We just need to use them. We cannot let ourselves get distracted from the urgency of accountability, especially in those settings where we continue to receive reports of conflict-related sexual violence. After all, holding perpetrators accountable is not only the right thing to do, it deters others from enacting this violence in the future. It strengthens the rule of law. It makes reconciliation more likely, and it makes inclusive and democratic transition possible. Second, we must defend and empower survivors through a survivor-centered approach. That means listening to survivors, responding to their unique needs, and providing the resources and legal support they ask for and that they need. We have learned just how important it is to create a supportive environment to avoid re-traumatizing those who have experienced conflict-related sexual violence and to ensure that they are treated with dignity and respect. When we provide survivors with the resources they need to heal and to recover, we help them tremendously, and we help break the silence and the stigma surrounding sexual violence and conflict as well. Centering our support around survivors while securing justice for them is the clearest and the most powerful way to empower survivors to become agents of peace and voices of change, as we see from our colleague Nadia across this room. And again, Nadia, thank you so much for bringing your voice to us today. Third and finally, because all gender-based violence is rooted in gender inequality, we must advance the empowerment of women and girls in all of their diversity. To that end, the United Nations and all member states should apply conflict-sensitive and participatory gender analysis to our interventions and to our work. We need to ensure we are addressing the underlying societal norms and power relations that, when combined with weak or absent state institutions, lead to gender-based violence. We need to advance gender-sensitive early warning and response, and we must persevere in our promotion of the meaningful participation of women in decision-making roles, especially in conflict prevention, resolution, and peacekeeping processes. When we integrate women and girls into atrocity prevention efforts, we do more to prevent those atrocities. It is that simple. In the long term, the best defense against conflict-related sexual violence is an equal and just society, one where all women and girls have respect for their human rights, and where we enjoy equal protection under the law, where we have timely access to justice, and where we have the educational opportunities we all deserve. As the late Secretary Albright used to say, democracy is a parent to peace, and common sense tells us that true democracy is not possible without the full participation of women. So let us make democracy possible. Let us build those just and inclusive societies. And in the meantime, let us hold perpetrators accountable, take a survivor-centered approach, and integrate gender equity in everything we do. And as Nadia said, survivors don't want our pity. They want justice. They all have made, all of the women who spoke today, they all have made recommendations to us today. Let's pay homage to them and follow their lead. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Her Excellency Ambassador Ms. Thomas Greenfield for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Norway, Madam Ambassador.
Thank you, President. And thanks to Special Representative of the Secretary General, Pramila Patten, and to the civil society briefers for your very valuable statements. Time and time again, We hear in this chamber how sexual violence is being used as a tactic of war. And every year, these reports put into stark relief how we continue to fall short in effectively addressing both the immediate effects and the root causes of conflict-related violence, a grave violation of international law. This is completely abhorrent. I therefore wish to thank the UK for focusing this year's open debate on accountability as prevention. And I want to thank especially Nadia, Marina, and Helena for your very powerful interventions and for sharing your recommendations. Your testimonies remind us how participation and protection are inextricably linked. We see in Syria, as Mariana so strongly have testified, conflict-related violence in detention settings, the heightened risk of sexualized violence against displaced women, and negative coping mechanisms such as child labor and early and forced marriages. These are of particular concern. In Ethiopia, we are horrified by the numerous reports of, and from what we heard from Helena, systematic rape and gender-based violence. And we welcome the Commission of Experts established by the Human Rights Council to investigate allegations of human rights violation and abuses by all parties. This is essential for accountability, prevention, and reconciliation. And in Ukraine, we are deeply shocked by the atrocities committed against civilians in places that have been held by Russian forces, as well as the disturbing reports of conflict-related sexual violence. Ukrainian women and girls are placed further at risk by targeted Russian attacks against civilian infrastructure, forcing displacement and family separation, and depriving victims and survivors from access to essential health services. President, in this council, we are still discussing what a comprehensive human rights-based and survivor-centered approach means. To make the move to actual implementation, we must recognize the root causes of CRSV and dare to suggest concrete measures. In this spirit, I will put forward 3 areas that Norway firmly believes will promote accountability and prevention. If sufficiently scaled up, addressed jointly and through multi-stakeholder coordination. First, we must build the capacity of law enforcement, security, and military sector personnel in both UN peace operations and national institutions. This helps reinforce accountability structures, tackles underlying structural inequalities and attitudes, and ensures that policies and action plans are actually put to use. A good example is how the UNMISS SGBV Specialized Police Team is supporting South Sudan's National Police Service. Second, we must invest in access to coordinated healthcare and services, legal services, and information. A commendable example is UNFPA's One-Stop Center, which are established in cooperation with local authorities, like in Mosul, Iraq. Third, placing the need of survivors at the center of our effort means also promoting and supporting their agencies. They themselves must be allowed to define and design what they think are necessary measures for prevention, protection, and accountability. As USG Patton has highlighted, reparations are what survivors of SRSV request most and yet still receive least. Let me also congratulate you, Nadia, and the UK on tomorrow's launch of the MORAD Code. an important initiative to place survivors' rights at the center of investigations and documentation of CRSV. President, financing and resources go hand in hand with monitoring and implementation of all three of these recommendations. As has been highlighted by the USG's office and echoed by UN Women, UNFPA, and civil society, the scale of the resources is far from equal to the scale of actions needed on the ground. Council members and the broader UN membership must join forces to ensure that the UN and CSOs have the necessary expertise, financing, and access in place. President, a final point. We all recognize that the elephant in the room is the lack of political will. By sending a strong collective signal through all Council's decisions and in our dialogue with conflict parties, we must remind them of their obligation and influence their actions. And we must insist on women's full, equal, and meaningful participation and protection from violence, not merely as an end in itself, but as a prerequisite for peace and stability. I hope this Council will send a strong signal today, clearly condemning any and all use of conflict-related sexual violence. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Norway. Thank you, Madam Ambassador. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates, Your Excellency.
Mr. President, Lord Ahmed, I would like to begin by thanking you and welcoming you for chairing this important open debate. We are delighted that the UK has joined the Shared Women, Peace and Security Presidency Commitment, and we welcome the growing number of signatories. I would like also to thank Special Representative Pamela Patton for her detailed briefing and the critical work of her office. I also want to thank Ms. Murad for her insightful briefing. The UAE has always admired Ms. Murad's courageous work, and we are proud to support Nadia's initiative, her nonprofit empowering the brave Yazidi women of Iraq. I listened also carefully to the briefings by Ms. Karkutli and Ms. Berhano. Mr. President, sexual and gender-based violence is a despicable scourge, and this Council must do more to prevent it in conflict situations. When such violence is used as a tool of war, it exacerbates conflict and sets back progress towards inclusive, equal, and stable societies. As the rate of conflict and instability around the world increases, so too have the disturbing reports on the situation of women and girls in these settings. Women and girls in Afghanistan continue to be subjected to sexual slavery and rape. In Syria and Iraq, the heinous acts of Daesh continue to have an impact. At the Ukrainian border, women and girls are targeted by human and sex traffickers as they flee the conflict. And as we also heard today, the tragic experiences of women and girls face in many other conflicts. The United Arab Emirates, therefore, welcomes the focus on the structural prevention, resilience building, and accountability in the Secretary General's report this year. As members of the international community, the Security Council and the wider UN membership have a responsibility to prioritize prevention, ensure accountability, and end this horror. In this regard, we would like to make the following recommendations. First, the most effective response to sexual and gender-based violence is preventing it from happening in the first place. As this Special Representative has pointed out time and again, effective prevention strategies require addressing root causes, most notably structural gender inequality and harmful social norms. This includes strengthening women's and girls' resilience by ensuring they enjoy equal access to public life, education, and economic participation. Recognizing and understanding their role as active agents of change and dynamic members of society is thus the first step in prevention. Second, accountability needs to be pursued by upholding and strengthening the rule of law. There is a transformative period following conflict and crisis to strengthen the capacity of relevant national institutions, such as law enforcement and the security sector, so that they may better uphold the rule of law. Capacity building, if coupled with the deployment of gender and protection expertise that focuses on a survivor-centered approach, can be a critical tool to establish a system that promotes accountability. Third, the international community must hold non-state armed groups accountable for conflict-related sexual violence, not least because they are increasingly central actors in conflict settings. Grave violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law require accountability. A strong tool for the Security Council to achieve this is to include conflict-related sexual violence as a standalone designation criterion for sanctions, and to list individuals and entities whenever they are responsible for the commission of such acts. In this regard, we welcome the recent decision made by the Council to designate the Houthis as an entity, including for perpetrating a policy of sexual violence in conflict. Efforts like these contribute to the prevention of and response to these crimes on the ground, and Council members must remain consistent in their approach. In conclusion, there is no justification for the fact that conflict-related sexual violence remains a reality. The Council, the UN, its member states, the private sector, and civil society must work together and make it a priority to eliminate these crimes once and for all. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates. I now give the floor to the representative of India. Mr. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, we thank the United Kingdom for convening the open debate on this important issue. We also thank SRSG Pramila Patten and all other distinguished briefers for sharing their insights. In the last 3 decades, the international community has played an important role in fixing accountability for conflict-related sexual violence, thereby sending out a strong message that sexual violence has no place in the civilized world. The prosecutions of conflict-related sexual crimes by the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and for Rwanda, UN Security Council resolutions on sexual violence, and United Kingdom's Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict initiative have contributed to addressing this complex and sensitive issue in its entirety. Despite this progress, it is indeed distressing that sexual violence in conflict situations continue unabated amidst a culture of impunity as a tactic of war, torture, and terror in armed conflicts, especially by non-state actors. Again, despite the robust framework put in place by the Security Council since 2007, with the launching of the UN Action Against Sexual Violence in Conflict, the levels of compliance by parties to the conflict remains low. Majority of the parties listed in the Secretary General's annual report on conflict-related sexual violence are persistent perpetrators who continue to commit or abet sexual violence in armed situations. This must stop. The Council must focus on identifying and bridging the implementation gaps to prevent the atrocities and facilitate the rehabilitation and reintegration of survivors. Mr. President, my delegation wishes to highlight the following 6 issues for the consideration of the Council. First, national governments have the primary responsibility for prosecuting and deterring such crimes in conflict situations on their territories, even if these are alleged to have been committed by non-state actors. Member states should ensure effective prosecution of sexual violence as a self-standing crime. Second, upon request, the UN must assist national authorities in developing capabilities to strengthen their national legal frameworks and related structures for speedy investigation and prosecution of perpetrators. This should also be a priority in post-conflict situations to address holistically the structural and cross-cutting gender inequalities that perpetuate sexual violence. Third, the member states must adopt a victim-centered approach to preventing and responding to sexual violence and armed conflicts in line with Resolution 2467 that seeks to strengthen justice and accountability and calls for a survivor-centered approach in the prevention and response to conflict-related sexual violence. States must ensure adequate focus and resources for comprehensive and non-discriminatory assistance for victims of sexual violence by providing for medical, psychological, social, and legal services. A key starting point in strengthening the accountability process is by addressing the endemic stigma attached to survivors of sexual violence and fear of reprisals by offenders, thereby helping them to come forward to speak to investigators and testify in court. Fourth, terrorism and violent extremism conducive to terrorism continue to be the biggest global threat to peace and security, with women suffering disproportionately in the resulting conflicts engendered by them. Sexual violence, primarily directed against women and girls and increasingly among men and boys by terrorists, remains a cause of concern. The nexus between terrorism, trafficking, and sexual violence and armed conflict needs to be broken. Fifth, the sanctions regimes and other targeted measures by the Council need to be strengthened to utilize their full potential to deter perpetrators of sexual violence and armed conflict. Last but not the least, the member states must provide a conducive environment for the participation and inclusion of women in political processes and decision making. India has moved ahead from women's development to women-led development. We have been advocating this idea for lasting peace in our neighborhood, including in Afghanistan, in line with the UN Security Council Resolution 2593, especially relating to women, children, and minorities. Mr. President, in 2017, Prime Minister Modi joined the circle of leadership that was formally established by the Secretary General at the high-level meeting on the prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse in the United Nations operations. India has also signed the Secretary General's Voluntary Compact against sexual exploitation and abuse. India has the distinction of sending the first all-women formed police unit contingent to Liberia in 2007. This unit mitigated incidents of crime against women, deterred sexual and gender-based violence, and helped rebuild safety and confidence among the Liberian population. In this process, it also operationalized the spirit of the landmark Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security into action. These courageous Indian women patrolled Monrovian streets at night, taught Liberian women self-defense skills, and conducted classes on combating sexual the number of women peacekeepers. We also support increasing the deployment of women protection advisors for effective monitoring, analysis, and reporting arrangements on conflict-related sexual violence in the field. To conclude, India reaffirms its commitment to actively contribute to a collective endeavor in effectively tackling sexual violence in situations of armed conflict. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of India. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I now give the floor to the representative of Brazil, Your Excellency.
Many thanks, Mr. President. It is highly regrettable to be here today calling once more for an end to an utterly unacceptable crime committed most against women and girls, but also against men and boys. Sexual violence in conflict destroys the social fabric of communities and inflicts long-lasting psychological trauma, having a direct bearing on the resilience of peace and on the prospects for sustainable development. Perpetrators, be they state or non-state actors, terrorists or mercenaries, should now be thinking twice before they commit such crimes. But they do not stop. They continue because they know that most probably their actions will go unpunished, even though they are committing well-known violations of international human rights and international humanitarian law, abhorrent acts prohibited both in times of war and peace. Today's briefings and the latest report of the Secretary General serve as stark reminders that the fight to end sexual violence as a weapon of war, as a tool of intimidation and social control in conflict and post-conflict situations is very far from over. Mr. President, Lord Ahmad, Brazil thanks the United Kingdom for organizing today's debate and the briefers for their comprehensive presentations. In addition to that, we take this opportunity to commend Special Representative Pramila Patten for her work and her office for the crucial role they play in international efforts to combat sexual violence and conflict. We also thank Ms. Nadia Murad, Mariana Karkutli, and Helena Berjano for their testimonials. They show us the strength of the committed work of victims themselves and of their organizations on the ground. Addressing the prevailing culture of impunity for the crime of sexual violence in conflict is paramount, not just as a means of reparation, but also of delivering justice by making perpetrators accountable for their crimes. It is also, as experience shows, an important tool to prevent the horrific scenarios described by the aforementioned reports and a myriad of other accounts. As Ms. Simmers Bauhaus told us on Monday, and Ms. Pramila confirmed today, red signs are now flying all over as allegations of sexual violence are reported in the context of the conflict in Ukraine. Brazil reiterates its calls for urgent independent investigations of such allegations and welcomes the participation of UN women experts, skilled and experienced, to investigate sexual violence, abuse, and exploitation in the works of the Commission of Inquiry of the Human Rights Council. This council should respond appropriately to all allegations of sexual violence in conflicts under its agenda. This response must recognize the problem and strengthen, whenever appropriate, the mandates of peacekeeping operations and special political missions as to promote real changes on the ground. Recent reports in South Sudan offer a horrific account of sexual violence being used as a weapon of war and remind us of the grave consequences of widespread impunity for sexual violence in conflict. The recent approved Resolution 2625 on South Sudan, which renews the mandate of UNMISS, expresses serious concerns at those ongoing reports and underlines the urgency of timely investigations, not only to support accountability, but also to provide assistance and protection to survivors. It enables UNMISS to curb sexual violence within its core directive for the protection of civilians. In fact, UNMISS may use a variety of means and areas of deployment to deter, prevent, and respond to sexual and gender-based violence, including by facilitating access to organizations that provide services and support to survivors. But having such provisions in the Council's resolutions is not enough. This Council must urgently address the funding shortfalls that prevent it from delivering a satisfactory response. And that includes having the resources, for instance, to continue to deploy women's protection advisors to bring behavioral change through engagement with the parties to the conflict. It is also essential to guarantee that pre-deployment training of UN troops and personnel includes capacity building to recognize and respond to sexual violence in conflict, including on early warning and risk mitigation. Troops should be trained to help foster an enabling environment for surviving victims to seek support and for perpetrators to be persecuted for their crimes. Peace agreements and post-conflict arrangements hardly ever deal with the situation of those who have been subjected to violence during conflict and its aftermath. With the support of the Peacebuilding Commission, this Council should continue to advocate for the inclusion of references in peace agreements, consider the imperative to, ideally at least, eradicate all forms of sexual violence, especially against all women and girls, and of provisions related to accountability for gender-based violence. Promoting full, equal, and meaningful participation of women in decision-making processes and peace talks also means tackling the root causes of sexual violence and conflict, including structural gender inequality and harmful social norms that lead to the stigmatization and discrimination of survivors. Any and every step towards the implementation of women and peace and security resolutions is very much welcome. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Brazil. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
主席先生，
Mr. President,
Good afternoon. We're delighted to be joined by the Secretary General, by the Deputy Secretary General, and by Rebecca Greenspan, the Secretary General of UNCTAD. We are here to launch the report, Global Impact of War in Ukraine on Food, Energy, and Finance Systems. The Secretary General will make some opening remarks. Ms. Greenspan will also make short remarks on the report, and then we'll open it up to questions. Sir, please.
Well, ladies and gentlemen of the press, thank you very much for coming. Now, since the Russian Federation's invasion of Ukraine, the world's attention has been focused on the war's terrifying levels of death, destruction, and suffering. And from the start, the United Nations has been actively engaged in delivering humanitarian support to the people in Ukraine, the people that are paying the highest price, and to the host countries of the fastest growing refugee crisis in Europe since the Second World War. But less attention has been paid to the global impact of the war in all its dimensions, in a world that was already witnessing increased poverty, hunger, and social unrest. the war is supercharging a three-dimensional crisis: food, energy, and finance that is pummeling some of the world's most vulnerable people, countries, and economies. And all this comes at a time when developing countries are already struggling with the slate of challenges not of their making: the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, and the lack of access to adequate resources to finance the recovery in the context of persistent and growing inequalities. We are now facing a perfect storm that threatens to devastate the economies of many developing countries. And that is why, in the earliest days of this war, I established the Global Crisis Response Group on Food, Energy, and Finance, facilitated by a task team in the UN Secretariat, reporting to a steering committee involving all UN agencies and international financial institutions. Today, we are launching the task team's first report. And I'm joined by the Secretary General of UNCTAD, Rebecca Greenspan, who coordinates the task team, and by the Deputy Secretary General, who presides over the steering committee. Ms. Greenspan will go through the recommendations, but I want to highlight two overarching points made crystal clear in this report. First, the impact of the war is global and systemic. As many as 1.7 billion people, one-third of whom are already living in poverty, are now highly exposed to disruptions in food, energy, and finance systems that are triggering increases in poverty and hunger. 36 countries count on Russia and Ukraine for more than half of their wheat imports, including some of the poorest and most vulnerable countries of the world. And prices were already on the rise, but the war has made a bad situation far worse. Wheat and maize prices have been very volatile since the war began, but are still 30% higher just since the start of the year. At the same time, Russia is a top energy supplier. Oil prices are up more than 60% over the past year, accelerating the prevailing trends. The same goes for natural gas prices, which have risen by 50% in recent months. And fertilizer prices have more than doubled. As prices climb, so does hunger and malnutrition, especially for young children. Inflation is rising, purchasing power is eroding, growth prospects are shrinking, and development is being stalled, and in some cases, gains are receding. Many developing economies are drowning in debt, with bond yields already on the rise since last September, leading now to increased risk premiums and exchange rate pressures. And this is setting in motion a potential vicious circle of inflation and stagnation, the so-called stagflation. The report also shows that there is a direct correlation between rising food prices and social and political instability. Our world cannot afford this. We need to act now. And that leads to the second point, clearly demonstrated by this report. We can do something about this three-dimensional crisis. We have the capacity to cushion the blow. And the report offers more than a dozen recommendations, but I would boil down the messages to three fundamental points. First, we must not make things worse. That means ensuring a steady flow of food and energy through open markets. It means lifting all unnecessary export restrictions, and this is not the time for protectionism. And it means directing surpluses and reserves to those in need, and keeping a lead on food prices and calming the volatility in food markets. Second, we can maximize this moment to push for the transformational change our world needs. Look no further than the energy crisis. In the immediate term, countries must resist hoarding and release strategic stockpiles and additional reserves. But now is also the time to turn this crisis into an opportunity. We must work towards progressively phasing out coal and other fossil fuels and accelerating the deployment of renewable energy and a just transition. And third, we need to pull developing countries back from the financial brink. The international financial system has deep pockets. I've been strongly advocating for its reform, But developing countries need help now, and the funds are there. So we need to make them available to economies that need them most, so that governments can avoid default, provide social safety nets for the poorest and most vulnerable, and continue to make critical investments in sustainable development. This is not a crisis that can be solved piecemeal, country by country. This global and systemic emergency requires global and systemic solutions. And the report includes concrete recommendations for international financial institutions to increase liquidity and fiscal space. As we approach the spring meetings of the World Bank and the IMF, we need political will and leadership. Resources are available. We must speak with one voice. Action today will prevent suffering tomorrow. Dear friends, above all, this war must end. The people of Ukraine cannot bear the violence being inflicted on them, and the most vulnerable people around the world cannot become collateral damage in yet another disaster for which they bear no responsibility. We need to silence the guns and accelerate negotiations towards peace now, for the people of Ukraine, for the people of the region, and for the people of the world. Thank you. Rebecca.
It's on.
Thank you very much, Secretary General, for your words, and most importantly, for raising your voice for the developing countries and the people that are suffering the consequences of this consecutive crisis, and for establishing the Global Crisis Group on Food, Energy, and Finance, and the Steering Committee, the DSG, and the task team. So, as the Secretary General have said and already established, this is a far-reaching crisis, and I want to go with you through the recommendations that we are given to cushion the blow, as the Secretary General have rightly said. In terms of the food crisis, the most important thing that the Secretary General has already said is to keep markets open. We urge all countries to keep their food markets open and to cease any restrictions that will maintain the international trade and food in food and fertilizers not flowing to the countries that need them. Hoarding and speculative movements threaten food supplies, and we need solidarity in these times of crisis. So the first thing, let's keep markets open. Second, let's help countries help their poor. Countries will need help and support to be able to establish the safety nets and be able to support the households that will suffer from this crisis. Poor households dedicate most of their income to food. And so the increase in food prices really hurt them the most. We need to help countries to help the poor households and vulnerable households that will suffer from this war. And for that, they will need financial support. Third, let's help the small farmers, because the small farmers will be hit by the prices of fertilizers. So we need to prevent from production going down in the next cycle. So let's try to support livelihoods, not only lives. And livelihoods will be important for small farmers and food producers and local food processors we need them to have adequate access to seeds, to fertilizers, and to fuels. And the last recommendation is to keep the freight prices stable and predictable, because part of the cost and the rise in prices in food and in energy comes from very steep increases in the freight cost for trade. And obviously, dear Secretary General, as you have always insisted, food purchases by the United Nations World Food Program, the world's biggest provider of humanitarian assistance, must be exempt from any food restrictions with immediate effect so they can continue to perform their duties. With respect to fuel, we know that gas and fertilizer prices have more than doubled, as the Secretary General already explained. So we urge governments to continue a coordinated approach to make strategic reserves available to the global market. And where possible, we must reduce the use of wheat for biofuels because we will need wheat for food. We must ensure support for the vulnerable countries and vulnerable populations who must be able to afford fuel. But let's try to support them by giving to people the resources they need to be able to have access to energy, because universal subsidies to fossil fuels will be very difficult to bring down afterwards. So let's help people and households and not, people that not necessarily will benefit from it. In finance, and let me go for another very important recommendation, and is that we demand more efficient energy consumption that will help drive the energy transition. We demand more ethical behavior from all of us so we can push and use this opportunity for the energy transition and not, like the Secretary General said, see regress in terms of more sustainable energy sources. We can do more with less. We can have more sustainable behavior to accelerate the transition. So now let's go to finance. As the Secretary General said, we are on the brink of a global debt crisis. We already have seen that in several countries already. Yesterday, we had the default of Sri Lanka, and other countries are already asking for help for their debt crisis. We have to prevent another lost decade for developing countries. So we need to enact immediately in the international financial system, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, to do everything possible to ensure more liquidity to the countries, making use of the already windows that they have for fast disbursement, for emergency. Let me say that they have done that before. They have done that in the crisis of the pandemic of COVID-19. So we need them to do it again. We need them to put those windows very quickly to be accessed by the countries that really need them. We also call on the International Monetary Fund to increase and maintain access limits for rapid financial assistance, increase the annual access limits to the rapid credit facility and the rapid financing instruments to crisis levels, and extend the existing cumulative access limit towards 2024, because many countries already use a lot of their quota in the former pandemic. You said precisely, Secretary General, that this comes on top of climate change, and this comes on top of the pandemic, the crisis that these countries suffered with the pandemic. So they have exhausted a lot of the possibilities and the space that they had with the international organizations. So we need to increase the access limit that they have so they can have access to those resources. And we need to suspend interest rate surcharges for at least 2 years, because this is a global pandemic. It doesn't make sense to charge countries a surcharge in interest on a global crisis that they didn't enact. That is not bad behavior. That is not their immediate responsibility. So it doesn't make sense to have these surcharges that are a factor that deepens the problem that these countries are going through. And for sure, we need to operationalize very quickly the resilience and sustainability trust that the IMF has proposed. And let me be clear on this, because these are instruments that are already there, that they can use immediately, that only need flexibility and political will to be for them to be put into operation very quickly. So the RST, the Resilience and Sustainability Trust that the IMF has proposed, is a very important instrument. So we need that to be operationalized immediately. And we need to raise our voices for the countries that have these special drawing rights and don't need them, to give them to the Resilient and Sustainability Trust. There are 400 billion equivalent dollars, yes, in special drawing rights that are in the hands of countries that don't need it. This is a very large sum of resources. So we need the countries, and we pledge the countries to really give those SDRs to the IMF, so the Resilient and Sustainability Trust can really be there for the access of the developing countries that will need it in this present crisis. And we have to support the debt initiative that was approved in the G20 for the low-income countries, but that has not been extended. The SSI has to be extended for all the low-income countries immediately, precisely for debt relief, because debt issues need to move higher in the political agenda. Political will and international leadership are essential to do that. And we need really to avoid a domino effect in terms of debt, because debt is piling up in many of these countries because of the successive crisis. And finally, if you allow me, Secretary General, to really claim for instruments of climate and nature debt relief. There is a clear opportunity to learn from the past and be able to go for and scale up a comprehensive, large-scale debt relief linked to improve climate adaptation and mitigation in the context of food security, precisely because of the war in Ukraine. And finally, a revised and implementable G20 common framework for debt treatment is needed urgently to provide timely debt restructuring to countries in need. Many of these initiatives are there, but they have not been able to be in the quantum that the world needs, because we didn't think that the pandemic will last for 2 years and not for 1. We didn't think that there will come another crisis on top of COVID-19, that is the war in Ukraine, with these increases in prices of food and energy. So we need to scale up the instruments that we already have to be able to give the countries the relief, to cushion the blow, like the Secretary General has said, to really help developing countries to go through this crisis. This is not a crisis of 1 or 2 countries. There are 107 countries that have exposure, severe exposure to at least one of the dimensions of this crisis, to the increase in food, or to the increase in energy, or to the increase in tightening conditions in finance. And this says that these 107 countries can get into an unstable economy and an unstable political blow because of this severe exposure to one of these three-dimensional crises that we are suffering. And from those 107, Secretary General, as you said, these 107 countries, 69 countries have exposure, severe exposure to the three dimensions. They are severely exposed to food increases, price increases, severely exposed to increases in energy prices, severely exposed to very difficult financial conditions with no fiscal space and with no external financing to cushion the blow on the most vulnerable, on the poor. So we need to be able to push the international community to act with the urgency that these figures show today, and accompany and be together with the voice of the Secretary General that has raised his voice to really put the attention and awareness on the difficult situation that other countries are suffering precisely because the war in Ukraine.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rebecca. We'll go to Edie Leder, Associated Press.
Mr. Secretary General, Madam Deputy Secretary General, and Ms. Greenspan, thank you very much for doing this briefing on behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association. Welcome. Mr. Secretary General, you've talked about the need for political will and leadership. What actions are the United Nations taking to generate this political will and leadership to address these issues quickly? And how optimistic are you that this is going to happen? And you've also stated quite clearly that the war must end. Yet yesterday we heard the president of Russia saying it isn't going to end until their goals are met, and basically ruling out negotiations. So what's happening with your effort to get a humanitarian ceasefire?
Well, there are several questions, and I'll try to answer all of them. First of all, we are approaching a crucial moment for many of the decisions we are talking about, the spring meetings of the IMF and World Bank. And both the IMF and World Bank are part of the steering committee. We are in close contact with them. And today, 4 members of our steering committee have made an appeal in relation to food security, including the IMF and the World Bank. And so this is a crucial moment to make sure that member states that are represented in the spring meetings understand the need to use the instruments that the IMF and the World Bank and other international financial institutions have. The instruments are there. As I said, the pockets are deep and the money is there, but it needs to be used. This is a crucial moment. Now, to make sure that we are able to develop political leadership, I invited 6 heads of state and government to be champions of this process. And I can announce you that they have accepted. It will be co-chairing with me the president of Senegal, that is president of the African Union, the president of Indonesia, the prime minister of Germany, the prime minister of Barbados, the prime minister of Denmark, and the prime minister of Bangladesh. And we'll be working together in making sure that we do global advocacy in relation to all these questions, that we mobilize political will. Because the amount of suffering we are witnessing in Ukraine, of course, and let's not forget it, but around the world by people that have already suffered the impact of many dramatic consequences of climate change, of the COVID, of the lack of vaccination, of the lack of financial resources for recovery. Now this blow is really too much. And we need really to have a sense of urgency. Resources are there, measures can be taken quickly. Several countries have important stocks of food and of energy. They can put them in the market. On the other hand, restrictions need to be abolished, namely export restrictions. There should be no hoarding of any of these products. But most important than everything else, we need to use immediately the financial instruments that are available. I've been saying many times that our global financial system is morally bankrupted. I've been saying many times that we need a deep reform in the global financial system. But now it's a matter of emergency, is to use the instruments that are there and need to be mobilized. And I count on political will. And we have established, as I said, mechanisms to mobilize as much as we can the political leaders in relation to these objectives. Now, the second question was related to the war. And so Martin Griffith went to Moscow and Kyiv. I don't think we have the chance to have a humanitarian ceasefire as we wanted globally. But there is a number of proposals that were made, and we are waiting for an answer from the Russian Federation in relation to those proposals, including different mechanisms for local ceasefires, for corridors, for humanitarian assistance, evacuations, and different other aspects that can minimize the dramatic impact on civilians that we are witnessing. And I believe that you mentioned a statement in which it was said that the peace negotiations were dead. I would remind you that we are in an Easter period, and the Easter period is about resurrection.
Sam Azam.
Thank you. My name is Ibtisam Azim from Al Arabi Al Jadid newspaper. I have two questions. First to the Secretary General. You have been sounding the alarm a lot of times about different issues, the ones you talked today about, and there's a lot of promises that world leaders are saying, but they are not delivering. So my question to you, what's your plan B to put more pressure on these world leaders? And my question to Ms. Greenspan is about trade and women empowerment, and if you to what extent are influential countries committed to empowering women in trade, given the fact that trade is extremely important also to the issues you talked about. Thank you.
Plan B is never to give up on the plan A, because nothing can replace the political will that is needed for these decisions to be taken. We can say what is needed, the resources are available, we need political decisions. So the plan B is to insist on the plan A for these political decisions to be taken by those that have the capacity to do it.
Thank you, Michelle Nicol.
No, there is a question.
I'm sorry, Rebecca, I apologize.
Yeah, women trade, very important. Yes, we are really working very hard with women traders and the empowerment of women, especially in e-trade. Yes, and for them, it's very important not to have restrictions, because the restrictions hurt women the most. They cannot, really find any other ways and means, for the earnings of their families. So you are right. Even in the crisis, we have to insist in trade and women empowerment in trade.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you for the briefing. First of all, a question on the report: were sanctions that have been imposed in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, were they taken into consideration when pulling together this report? And Secretary General, Could you just clarify what you told us about the UN push for a humanitarian ceasefire? You're saying that you don't see a possibility at the moment for a humanitarian ceasefire in Ukraine. And what are the suggestions you have made to Russia? And if you could get President Putin on the phone, what would you say to him?
You have a question
On that? Well, we have taken into account all the facts. It's very difficult to be able to say what is what. What we have put together is objectively what are the impacts and the exposures from all what is happening because of the war in Ukraine. So everything is being taken into account because the figures reflect the objective impacts that they are having everywhere.
Well, a global ceasefire at the present moment doesn't seem to be possible. But there are lots of things that can be done in order to guarantee evacuation of civilians from areas of fighting, in order of guaranteeing humanitarian access in a reliable situation. And we also propose the creation of a mechanism involving the Russian Federation, the Ukraine, and the UN, and eventually other humanitarian entities, in order to have a cell to permanently together manage and avoid incidents in these kind of situations. We have had a number of moments in which it was said that there was a local ceasefire and that things would happen, and then things did not happen. And then everybody accuses everybody of everything. Instead of this, what we need is to bring the parties together and to manage together situations like these, to make sure that we have adequate evacuations, to make sure that we have adequate humanitarian access to the populations in need.
Thank you.
The Putin, I mean, the most important message is that we need to silence the guns and we need to have a serious negotiation to achieve peace.
You said a global ceasefire.
Sorry?
You referenced a global ceasefire. Do you mean a ceasefire in Ukraine is not possible?
At the present moment, a global ceasefire
In Ukraine.
in Ukraine doesn't seem possible. That was our appeal for humanitarian reasons, but it doesn't seem possible.
Beytul Anadolu.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General. Beytul Yürük. With Western nations supporting Ukraine and China taking side with Russia, do you think the world is going into another Cold War? And how do you think this war will reshape the future of the international order? Thank you.
Well, I'm not sure that things are exactly as you described, but I would say that at the present moment, I want everybody united in relation to support the people in need. We'll talk about the international order afterwards. Now, we have people in desperate need in many parts of the world. They are not interested in knowing what is the future of multilateralism. They are interested in having the financial support and the support in relation to the food and energy crisis that they require. Afterwards, there will be a very interesting and important discussion, and I think our common agenda is about it, how we can strengthen multilateralism and avoid the kind of divisions that you mentioned.
Sherwin Bryce Peace, South African Broadcasting.
Thanks, Jeff. Thank you, SG. Ms. Greenspan, my question is going to be for the Deputy Secretary General, who hasn't said a word during this briefing. DSG, let's talk particularly about Sub-Saharan Africa, a region you are very familiar with. What are the implications of this report if they are not implemented in terms of these recommendations? What are the implications for a region where the SG has talked about coups being back, you have staggeringly high youth unemployment, political instability, where it's very easy to break the camel's back? What are the risks here for Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa in particular?
Thank you, Sherwin, for reminding me I kept quiet for once. Now, this is very serious for Sub-Saharan Africa, and given the context that we see there, it's more than just the conflicts, it's also the climate crisis. So this multitude of crises that are happening in the region, this report gives us, again, the solutions to acting now with the instruments that we have. Otherwise, there will be even more instability. There will be even more crisis as we see it, and that crisis will go beyond borders. So for us, when you hear Rebecca talking about the 69 that are severe, all three, this is what sub-Saharan Africa will be prone to. But right now, we have the countries that are just one crisis. We need to prevent that one from becoming the three on food and energy and on the financing. So solutions here. There are immediate meetings where actions can be taken. The SG's Champions Group are voices of leaders who can convince their colleagues to take these actions where they can. And for us, it's about making sure those recommendations are practical, they're doable, and they are taken with a sense of urgency, lest what the fallout of this becomes one of several billion people. It's over 1 billion in Africa, but it will go beyond the borders.
Greg,
If I may, with severe or significant exposure to this crisis, I'm talking about the most dramatically impacted countries. We have 25 countries in Africa. Now, the risks for the African continent and for peace and stability in the African continent, beyond the risks for hunger and poverty of the African people, are now extraordinarily expanded. And we have, of course, a particular concern about Africa, in which the Deputy Secretary General has been leading. We have a process of developing a comprehensive strategy for the African continent more in general. But in relation to this crisis, Africa is particularly targeted.
Gregory, TASS News Agency.
Thank you very much. Secretary General, I'm wondering, given the fact that the World Food Programme has warned about the hunger on 2020 and the last year, why is group is creating only right now? And some experts consider this current food and energy crisis as a result of lack of investment in traditional source of energy. And so, given these facts, what do you think how the pace and methods of how this current crisis can affect on the pace and methods on the climate change response?
In relation to your first question, since if you look at the report, you see that the prices of food and the prices of energy have been climbing. What we have now is an acceleration. If you look at page 1 of the report, you see that for an index 100 of the FAO food price index in 2019, we came to the end of 2021 with an index of 130. So food prices were already climbing. And we came now to an index of 160. There is a clear acceleration. So obviously the food and energy prices were already on the rise. We had inflation already on the rise. What we have now is a dramatic impact of acceleration. Now, I think there was a lack of investment, but in renewable energy. If we had invested much more seriously in the last 10, 20 years in renewable energy, we would not be dependent on the permanent fluctuations in the markets in relation to fossil fuels. The fact that countries have not enough renewable energy, which is based on self-reliance, makes them much more dependent on markets, and markets that have always been extremely volatile. And so my answer is there has been indeed a lack of investment in the recent decades, but mostly, I believe, lack of investment in renewable energies. And there were many interests that, of course, were opposing that investment, and that is probably the reason why it has been so slow. And that is the reason why now we see countries rushing to understand that we need a world much less dependent on resources that cannot be replaced. I mean, that one day will be exhausted.
I'm Falk, CBS News.
Thank you so much. So a follow-up for DSG Mohammed from Sherwin's question. You mentioned world leaders who's on board with this? I mean, in terms of the grand assistance, we've seen numbers, but how much is that coming? How much are people actually paying their pledges? And then to the two SGs, and maybe you can answer this too. How much are the IFIs on board? I've gotten through most of the report, and you say the IMF, the World Bank, are they signed on? And has there been any consideration of alternate currencies, cryptocurrencies, things like that? Just curious. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I mean, you can see from the voices that we have of those in support from the 6 world leaders that the SGs talked about, and having the presidency of the G20 is not a small leadership involved in that. Right now, what we're seeing is that the resources are not going towards stemming the tide of this crisis, and that's what we need to see, that it does. We don't see ODA go into military expenditure, but that we see that it's additional if it's to protect lives, and that we need, to keep the ODA, to keep the foreign direct investment, to keep all the tools that we have existing that Rebecca has talked about in play. Let's see what happens in the spring meetings, because the spring meetings are an important signal as to whether this crisis is going to be taken seriously or not. It's doable. It is immediate. And it will send the signals of the engagement and the traction for wanting to avoid a global crisis, and that's what we're trying to do right now.
No, we are obviously in permanent consultation with the IMF and World Bank, but the IMF and World Bank people, like the UN Secretariat, they depend. The UN Secretary depends on the Security Council and the General Assembly, and the IMF leaders depend on their boards. And what we need now is the boards of the institutions, and in general, those that have power to act, allowing for instruments that are available. We are not suggesting anything new. We are only suggesting that instruments that are available to be effectively put in action.
Can I also just add that it's not just the IMF and the World Bank. We also have the heads of all the regional development banks, and this is important because this is going to happen in every region and country in the world. And so having them on board as well has been very helpful, and they have been working with Rebecca in the task team.
Mario Villar, FA.
Oh, crypto?
Sorry. Yeah. Mario Villar, FA.
A question on energy, perhaps for Ms. Greenspan. In the recommendations of the report, you support targeted relief for people that can't afford fuel right now, given the high prices, but you ask that this support isn't allocated universally, which is what some countries are doing right now. For example, in Western Europe, reducing the price of gasoline for consumers. Can you elaborate on why this is a bad idea?
Yeah, we understand that people need support right now, but we would like the support to be targeted and not universal subsidies to fossil fuels, because they are very difficult to then take away, and they will preclude to really accelerate the transition towards renewable energy and new and clean forms of energy. So we already have many experiences on this. Yes, we know what universal subsidies do. And we know also how effective can be when you have a good system that is designed to help the people that needs to have access to energy. That is a much better way to do it right now.
And if I may, this impact, the report is targeted at developing countries. And some countries, some developed countries have fiscal space to do whatever they want. But there are many developing countries that simply have no fiscal space to use universal instruments, and that need to be able to use the very narrow fiscal space to support the most vulnerable people. I think it's important to see that there are completely different perspectives. I was prime minister of a country, and I know what it is to act when there is fiscal space and what it is to act when there is no fiscal space. It's completely different.
Linda Fasulo, NPR.
This question's for Mr. Secretary General. You discussed the severe food crisis around the world, particularly in the poor countries. I was wondering if the UN has a policy in terms of purchasing food and energy from Russia to provide humanitarian aid to the poor countries. And also, since the UN is a great proponent of targeted sanctions, I mean, at least when, of course, there are UN sanctions, do you have a view, or I don't know what the status is in terms of the Russian people, in terms of Russia being able to buy humanitarian supplies, whether it's medical supplies or anything else?
Of course, we are concerned with the needs of vulnerable people everywhere. And in relation to the procurement policy of the World Food Programme, the procurement policy of the World Food Programme is based on its rules, and it is done. We all recognize that it is done in the best possible way. Unfortunately, the World Food Programme was buying 50% of its food from the Ukraine, and there is no way you can take those 50% out of the Ukraine at the present moment.
Linda Fasulo. Celia Levine. Yeah.
Mr. Secretary General, what do you say to, you talked about Africa earlier, what do you say to African countries that are saying the war in Ukraine is not our war, but we are going to pay a high price?
We say to them that the war in Ukraine affects everybody, so it's also their war. But I have to say that I understand the grievances of those that in many moments felt there was no international solidarity with them. So the best way is simultaneously to make developed world understand that it's important to support developing world in times in need, for developing world also to be able to assume that a situation like the war in Ukraine is also their situation.
Last question, Philippe, AFP.
Which is, we need global solidarity in all directions.
Thank you. Question from Mr. Gutierrez. Do you see genocide ongoing in Ukraine?
Well, genocide is strictly defined in international law. And for the UN, we rely on final legal determination by appropriate judicial bodies. So we are deeply concerned with violations of human rights. I've been saying it time and time again. We are deeply concerned with the dramatic impact of the conflict in this regard. But we leave the definition of whether there is or not a situation of genocide to the judicial bodies that are relevant in this regard. And by the way, there is an investigation at the International Criminal Court taking place in the Ukraine at the present moment.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
aux gens dans les mandats des missions de paix des Nations Unies, particulièrement dans les situations de conflit ou d'après-conflit. Dans le même ordre d'idées, nous notons avec intérêt l'action du réseau United Nations Action Against Sexual Violence in Conflict, UN Action, mettant en synergie les efforts de 21 entités des Nations Unies dans l'optique de prévenir la violence sexuelle liée au conflit, de répondre aux besoins des survivants et de lutter contre l'impunité. Monsieur le Président, il est temps que ce Conseil plaide unanimement en faveur de l'accès des victimes de violences sexuelles à la justice internationale. C'est là un gage d'espoir, de dignité et de rétablissement de leurs droits fondamentaux. Le déni de justice aux victimes est une circonstance aggravante dans leur processus de reconstruction. Nous sommes fermement convaincus que pour mieux prévenir et combattre les violences sexuelles liées aux situations de conflit, nous devons nous appuyer sur une approche axée sur les rescapés, sur leur protection et sur le renforcement de leur capacité de résilience. Car c'est en pensant les blessures invisibles causées par les guerres et les conflits armés, en apportant aux victimes les soins de santé mentale et le soutien psychosocial dont elles ont besoin, que nous nous tournerons résolument vers la réalisation de notre aspiration commune d'un monde en paix pour les générations présentes et futures. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of Gabon for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Kenya.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is particularly fitting that Lord Ahmad should have chaired this debate earlier, given his role as the Prime Minister's Special Representative on Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict. We thank your delegation for bringing this important debate to the Council. I also thank SRSG Pramila Patten and the other briefers for their insights. Ms. Nadia Murad, thank you very much for your extraordinary bravery and determination and service to the Yazidi people, to women, and to all humanity with what you're doing. Kenya strongly condemns gender-based violence and its manifestation in all contexts, and as it takes place in the brutality and inhumanity of the conflicts in Syria, Ukraine, Ethiopia, and other wars. Mr. President, war itself is the crime that opens the door to the kinds of war crimes we're discussing today. War, even when it purports the opposite, and particularly when it's prolonged, almost inevitably leads to the breakdown of law, order, and moral conscience. We must redouble our efforts to prevent and stop war. We must be rid of the illusions of limited or precision-guided war, which in the last 20 years have shown their serious limits. We must turn our knowledge and experience of mediation to innovation and boldness of vision to stop the present wars. Thank you, Helena Berhanu, for your words and recommendations, to the A3 and to the African Union. We hear and feel the pain of the Ethiopian people, and especially the suffering of the people of Tigray. We urge for cooperation and openness to mediation that enables full humanitarian access, ceasefire, and eventually to peace with justice. In the last year, the A3 has sought to stand with the people of Ethiopia as brother has taken arms against brother, and we will continue to do so. We have spoken up with strong recommendations. We have embraced the democratic aspirations of your country. We have urged humanitarian access and pushed for the Council's support for African Union and regional mediation. The A3 once in this chamber urged for ceasefire, observing that there is no lasting victory in crushing one's countrymen and countrywomen. I know this is still the position of the A3. As your neighbors and your brothers and sisters, we urge you on to embrace one another, to get beyond the intense suffering and pain that you're causing each other, and to reach for the peace that we all pray and hope for you. Mr. President, we're here in search of implementing commitments and existing frameworks. Kenya as a country has enacted strong laws and policies to combat sexual and gender-based violence, and we will champion the efforts in this chamber and outside it to continue to do so. Our focus for today is on sexual violence perpetrated by terrorist groups. The Secretary General's current report on conflict-related sexual violence underscores once again how sexual violence continues to be a tactic of war and terrorism. We are concerned that there is too little effort to ensure accountability for sexual violence perpetrated by terrorists. The Security Council should undertake strong efforts to list those responsible, including their chains of command. It should call for cases of sexual violence to be prosecuted within the context of terrorism. This should include the recommendation by Ms. Mariana Kakutli on sexual violence in prisons. We urge in that regard that the Security Council take steps to list and sanction administrators of prisons and their chain of command if their facilities are party to systemic and systematic sexual violence against prisoners. Mr. President, I'll propose 3 areas of action that I hope offer further opportunities for practical implementation. First, on member states' responsibility. States must escalate prosecution for gender-based violence and enhance efforts in preventing and responding to conflict-related sexual violence. All effort must be put to address stigmatization, discriminatory laws, and other cultural barriers that stand in the way of reporting and accountability. These should be reinforced by a gender-responsive and inclusive national security sector and the needed reforms to achieve it. Accountability and prevention demands localized identification of gaps and that communal infrastructure be operationalized for social awareness and sensitization programs, as well as access to justice mechanisms and medical and psychological care to the victims of sexual and gender-based violence. Secondly, on the role of the Security Council, we note that the current report underlines that the series of Council resolutions has helped to raise the cost of what has long been perceived as the cheapest and oldest weapon of war. We believe that the bar should be even higher. There is an urgent need to move from commitment to compliance, from resolutions to results. Beyond listings and incorporation of SGBV as a separate listing criterion in the relevant sanctions regimes, the Council should also take specific steps and deterrent measures to also increase the costs of acts of conflict-related sexual violence. Stronger integration and investment in the WPS counterterrorism and countering violent extremism agendas will also contribute to increase the cost of those atrocities. For example, the implementation of Resolution 2242 of 2015, which recognizes the acts of sexual and gender-based violence are part of the strategic objectives and ideology of certain terrorist groups, including Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Al-Shabaab, and Boko Haram, should be linked to other resolutions that touch on countering terrorism, including 2354, 2178, and 2331. Third, on cross-border cooperation. The intersecting elements of rising militarization, coup d'etat, and conflicts with a transnational character call for enhanced coordinated action, especially where such contexts lead to increased refugee and IDP situations with potential aggravation of conflict-related sexual violence and human trafficking. We call for more effective cross-border coordination between border security personnel, early warning mechanisms, national and regional women's protection advisors, and humanitarian actors to minimize prevention and reporting gaps in alignment to Resolution 2467 of 2019 that speaks to cross-border dynamics. Given the importance of this cross-border and regional coordination, Kenya supports strategies for advancing implementation of the mandate and the integration of women, peace, and WPS positions into the UN annual budgets of peace operations, particularly during transition processes in line with Resolution 2594. In this regard, Kenya looks forward to SRSG Patton's launch of her report in June. We also look forward to the international adoption of the Murad Code. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Kenya for their statements. And I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Marta Lucia Ramirez, Vice President and Minister for Foreign Affairs of Colombia. You have the floor.
Muchas gracias, señor
Many thanks
presidente.
indeed,
Lord
Mr.
Almas de
President.
Wimbledon, también muy buenas tardes
I'd
a
also
todos los
like
representantes
to wish a very
permanentes
good afternoon
de
to
los
all
miembros del
permanent
Consejo de
representatives
Seguridad,
of the
todas las
members of the
personas que nos
Security
están
Council, as well as
acompañando
all
hoy,
of the
pero muy
observers that are
especialmente
here with
quiero
us
saludar
today,
también
everyone that's
la
here with us
intervención de
today.
Pramila
In fact,
Patten
I
en
wish
su
to extend particular
informe muy
gratitude to
completo
Pramila
y
Patten for her
contundente
briefing and her very
sobre
comprehensive and unequivocal
reporte del
report
secretario general
on
sobre
the
la
Secretary
violencia
General's
sexual en los
report
conflictos.
on sexual violence
También
in
saludo
conflict.
muy
I also
especialmente la
extend special
intervención que hizo
greetings
Nadia
to
Murad, a
Nadia
quien todos
Murad
tenemos
and
realmente
thank
una
her
gran
for her
admiración
briefing.
por su
We have
liderazgo, por
great
su
admiration for her,
fuerza,
for her
por esa
leadership and for
capacidad de
her strength
convocatoria.
and for this
También
capacity
agradezco
she has to
muchísimo la
bring people together.
presentación
I'm also very
de Mariana
grateful
Carculi, todas las
to Marina
intervenciones que se han hecho.
Kalakakulitu for
Y yo
her briefing.
quisiera decir
And I
que no hay
wanted
que
to
ser
say
víctima de la
that
violencia sexual
you don't
dentro de un
have to
conflicto
be a victim
para
of
sentir la
conflict-related sexual
obligación
violence
moral
to
de
feel a
levantar
moral
la voz,
obligation to
para
speak
decir que
out.
este es un
Speak out to
delito
say that this
atroz
is an
y es un delito
atrocious
que debe
crime,
tener las
a crime
mejores
that must
capacidades institucionales,
see
tanto de los
institutions as
estados
strong
como
as they can
también del
be at a state
sistema
level and elsewhere to
multilateral para
tackle
poder
it.
prevenir
The multilateral system
adecuadamente
needs to be
y
as
para
strong as
poder
it can be
castigar
to
y
appropriately
asegurarnos que
prevent
no
and
haya
punish the
ningún
crime.
caso de
We need
impunidad.
to be as strong as we
Que
can to ensure that
independientemente
there
si
is
son
no
grupos
impunity.
terroristas o
And this applies regardless
narcotraficantes
of whether
o si son
the terrorist groups,
criminales en
drug
cualquier
dealing groups, or
condición o si se
criminals of
trata
any
de
type
guerra
that are
entre
perpetrating
estados,
this
el
crime,
mensaje
or
tiene que
whether we're
ser
talking about
contundente por parte de
cases
la
of sexual
comunidad
violence as part
internacional.
of war between states. We
Ninguno
have to speak
puede
out with one voice.
abrogarse
At a
el
national and
derecho de
international level,
utilizar el
nobody
cuerpo
can claim
de
the right
ningún
to
ser
use the
humano
body of
como
any human
tablero
being
de guerra,
as
como
a
tablero para
a
mostrar su
chessboard on
supremacía
which to fight
frente a
war.
un
No
contendor.
one can
El
say
cuerpo de las
that they're
mujeres no es un
above the
tablero
law, and no
de
one can
guerra y
say that
tiene
a
que
woman's
haber
body
una
can be used
contundencia
as a
mayor
theater
por
for
parte
war.
del sistema
And the
multilateral.
multilateral
En mi
system must
caso,
be
como
absolutely
vicepresidenta de
unequivocal in
Colombia,
stating
he
that
querido
fact.
asumir este tema de común
As
acuerdo con el liderazgo del
a member
presidente
of
Iván
the
Duque, que
Colombian
estuvo
government,
ayer
I've
acá,
worked alongside President
precisamente
Ivan
para que
Duque,
nuestro
who was
país
here
sea un
yesterday, to
ejemplo
ensure that our
en
country
todo lo
sets an
relacionado con la
example in
prevención y
everything
la
that's related
atención
to
a las mujeres para
preventing and
lograr la
tackling
verdadera
sexual
equidad
violence in
de género,
conflict,
porque acá se ha
and
dicho también con
ensuring
muchísima
that we set an
claridad,
example in terms
la
of dealing with
causa
women and
muchísimas
ensuring
veces
their rights
de la
and ensuring gender
violencia
equality.
sexual
Often,
contra las mujeres en los
sexual violence
conflictos
against women
es
in
justamente
conflict is
esa
precisely
desigualdad
the
de
fruit of
género.
gender
Y también la
inequality.
causa de la pobreza de muchas naciones
The
es
cause
la
of
desigualdad
poverty in many
de
nations is
género.
also
Lo que
gender
tenemos que
inequality
lograr
often.
nosotros
So
es
what we have to achieve
igualar
together
las
is
condiciones de
ensuring
las
an equal
mujeres,
playing field
darles
for
el
women
acceso
and
pleno
men. They need
a
to
una
have
vida en
women need
donde
to have
puedan
full
aplicar
access
sus
to a life
capacidades
where
y
they can fully
también
harness
contribuir
their
al
potential
desarrollo
and abilities
económico de sus
and contribute to
naciones.
the economic
Por esa
development of their
razón, en
nations.
Colombia le hemos dado
Consequently,
una
in
altísima
Colombia,
prioridad
we have
al
attached the utmost
empoderamiento
importance
económico
to
de las
the
mujeres
economic
dentro de esa
empowerment of
política de
women
equidad
as
de
part
género
of our
que he venido liderando desde la
gender policy
vicepresidencia,
that I've been
porque mujeres
spearheading
que
as
tengan
part of
autonomía
Ivan Duque's
económica
presidency.
son mucho
Women
menos
need
vulnerables
economic empowerment and
frente a
autonomy because
cualquier
those
tipo
women are much
de
less
violencia.
vulnerable to
Y
any type
también
of
sabemos
violence.
nosotros que
We
este es un
also
momento
know that this
en
is
donde
a
lo que está
moment in
viviendo el
which
mundo
what the
entero
world, what the
como
entire world
consecuencia de
is
la
witnessing as a
pandemia,
consequence of
de
the
las
pandemic,
consecuencias también
the
económicas ahora de
we're seeing
esta
those
guerra de
consequences, and we're
Rusia
also seeing the
contra
economic
Ucrania.
consequence of
Esto
Russia's
nos
war against
indica a
Ukraine.
nosotros que
All
va a
of this
haber un
situation
retroceso en materia
globally
de pobreza
indicates
en
that
el mundo
there will
entero.
be
Y ese
the progress
retroceso en
made on
materia de
poverty throughout the
pobreza
world will be
necesita
undone.
que las mujeres
And this
intervengan
means that
mucho
women
más en
need
la
to
economía,
have
no
a much
menos,
greater
al
role to play
contrario,
in the
mucho
economy,
más.
not a
Porque
lesser
si el
role, they need a greater
50%
role
de la
because if
población,
50%
que somos
of
las
the
mujeres del mundo
population,
entero,
that's
ingresamos al
women throughout the
mercado
world,
laboral
enter
como
the labor
emprendedoras,
market as
si las mujeres pueden
entrepreneurs,
ser
if women
empresarias,
can
dueñas de
be
empresas y
business
cuentan con el
owners,
apoyo
and if they
de los
have the
estados,
support of
el mundo
states,
entero
the
va a
entire
beneficiarse
world
de
will
ese capital
benefit from
humano
that
que de
human
manera
capital,
productiva
which
genere riqueza y
productively
contribuya a
generates
la
wealth
generación
and
de empleos.
contributes to the
Digo
creation
esto
of jobs.
porque
I
la
say all
causa
of
de las
that, colleagues,
mujeres
because
no es una causa individual de
the
las
women's
mujeres, tiene
cause
que
is
ser
not
una
one to be
causa
championed by
de la
women
humanidad
alone.
entera, de
It must
todas
be
las
championed by
naciones, de
humankind,
este
by all
momento tan
nations.
particular y
And
difícil que
that's
estamos
particularly
viviendo
important at
todos
in these
nosotros.
difficult
Y por
times
esa
that together
razón
we're all
nosotros recibimos
experiencing.
de verdad con una gran
And in
felicitación
light of all
a
of the
Pramila
above,
Patten las
we
recomendaciones que ha hecho
welcome the
el secretario
recommendations
general y que ella ha
made by the Secretary
recogido
General that we
hoy en
heard
su
from
informe.
about
Creo que este es un
through
momento
Pramila
en donde que
Patten.
hay que aplicar
At
la
this time, we
creatividad
need to
y
be
también
creative,
saludo esas
and I
recomendaciones
also welcome
adicionales
the
que ha hecho
additional
con mucha
recommendations
lucidez
made
la
in a
delegación de
very
México.
clear way,
En nuestro
lucid way
caso
by the
particular
delegation of
creemos
Mexico. As
que la
as
mejor
far as
manera
we're
de
concerned,
prevenir
we think
realmente
that
la
the best way
violencia
of really
contra las
preventing
mujeres
violence
y la
against
violencia
women
sexual
and
y la
sexual
violencia durante
violence
los
and
conflictos contra las
conflict-related violence
mujeres es
perpetrated against
justamente
women
dotándolas de
is
mayor autonomía
precisely by
económica,
giving women
permitiéndoles que
greater
participen
economic autonomy
activamente y
and
por eso
by
esa voz,
allowing them
ese
to
clamor
actively
de Nadia y
participate
de tantas
in the
otras
economies and
mujeres que han
also to
hablado
raise
acá
their
en el día de hoy,
voice.
tenemos que acompañarla con medidas
And
mucho
we
más
have to
eficaces
support women with
desde el
much more
sistema
effective
multilateral.
measures from
En
within the
Colombia
multilateral
estamos
system to
totalmente
ensure they can
convencidos
speak
que
out
cuando
as
la
many today
justicia
and yesterday
nacional
have.
no opera,
In
tiene que haber una
Colombia, we
justicia
believe that when
internacional
national
que se
justice is not
aplique a
working,
los casos de
international
violencia
justice actors
sexual
have to
dentro de
intervene
los
to deal with
conflictos o por fuera de los
conflict-related sexual
conflictos.
violence
Porque
or
es que muchas veces
violence that
entonces
occurs
caemos en
outside conflict.
esta discusión de si era un
Often
conflicto
we
armado o
talk
no era un
about
conflicto
whether
armado.
something's an armed
¿Qué
conflict
importa?
or a
Lo cierto es
conflict
que no puede haber
or
una
not,
violencia
rather,
sexual
and we deal
que
with
se ensañe contra el
violence within
cuerpo
those
de
optics,
las
but it doesn't really
mujeres.
matter.
Vemos
We're talking
nosotros que hay
about violence in
conflictos
any case,
internos,
which
unos tienen un
injures a
carácter
woman's body.
religioso,
There
otros tienen una
there's
causa étnica,
conflicts
otros son
that
conflictos
that
entre
have
estados, en otros
religious
casos es el
underpinnings, ethnic
narcotráfico. Y en todos ellos
underpinnings, or
realmente está
drug
esta
trafficking-related
característica común
conflicts. There's
de
a
la
wealth of
violencia
conflicts, but they
sexual
all share
en el
the
conflicto.
fact that there
Entonces,
is
por esa
sexual
razón
violence perpetrated
acompañamos
within these
definitivamente
conflicts.
esa
But
idea
whether we're
de
talking
que haya
about
una justicia
conflict-related sexual
internacional que
violence
se
or not,
aplique cuando la
sexual violence
justicia
needs to be dealt with, and
nacional
in all
no
cases,
opera y
international
cuando
justice
no hay
needs
la
to
voluntad
intervene.
política
When national
para que
justice
esa
cannot, and
justicia
when there
nacional
isn't
opere.
political will
También
for
creemos que hay que
national justice to
completar esto con
function,
otras
all of this needs to be
recomendaciones.
supplemented with
Nosotros
other
estamos convencidos
recommendations.
que hay que
We are
articular
convinced that
todas
we
las
need to
distintas áreas
establish
que tiene el
synergies
sistema
between
multilateral y
all
que tiene Naciones Unidas.
parts of the
Lo que se
multilateral
hace desde
systems
la
and the United
Comisionada para
Nations
los Derechos Humanos, lo
when
que
it
se
comes
hace
to
también,
sexual violence.
obviamente, desde el PNUD, el
The
trabajo que se
UNDP,
hace
the
desde ONU
IMO,
Mujeres, todo tiene que estar
UNHCR,
articulado para
UN
un
Women,
mismo fin,
everything has to be
que es
joined together so
prevenir
that
la
we can
violencia
together pursue
sexual en
one
los
goal, and that
conflictos,
is preventing
evitar la violencia contra las
conflict-related sexual
mujeres
violence and
y sobre
avoiding
todo
violence
evitar
against
la
women.
impunidad
Another goal,
en
of
estos
course,
casos
is to
de
avoid
violencia.
impunity
Y
when
por
violence
esa
does
razón
occur.
creemos
For
entonces
this
que es
reason, we
importante
believe that it
también que
is
desde este
also
Consejo de
vital that from
Seguridad
within this
se
Security
hagan
Council,
recomendaciones,
we
por ejemplo, a la
issue
banca multilateral,
recommendations,
porque
for example,
además de
to
que
the
haya una justicia
multilateral banks,
internacional
because for
para
there
los
to
casos de
be
violencia sexual,
international justice
debe haber
for
también
cases of sexual
condicionantes a la banca
violence, there also
multilateral para
needs
que
to
no le
be
otorgue créditos,
conditions
para que no
attached
haya
to loaning
cooperación
by the World Bank.
internacional,
So there
para
cannot
que
be
no haya
any credit
donantes que
issued
estén de
by
pronto
the
también con esos
World
recursos
Bank
estimulando esta
if
consolidación de unos regímenes
if
que
we
se
don't take into
ensañan con
account
la
sexual
violencia
violence.
sobre sus
Money can't be
ciudadanos
given
y
to
muchas
those
veces
that perpetrate
sobre las
violence
mujeres.
against citizens
Colombia
and
ha
against
propuesto a ONU
women.
Mujeres,
That
entre otras
condition
cosas,
needs to be
la
attached to the
necesidad de
granting
que
of
haya
finance.
un
Colombia believes
índice
that there needs
de
to be
autonomía económica de
an
las
economic
mujeres, porque tenemos que
autonomy
medir en cada
index for
país qué
women
acciones concretas se
because
están
we
tomando
need
en
we
esta
know that
materia. Y
countries
en
are
nuestro
taking
país,
specific
en cuanto a las
action to empower
recomendaciones que ha
women, but
hecho
we
el
need to be able to
informe,
measure what's being done.
evidentemente ayer lo explicó el presidente Iván Duque con
Yesterday,
toda la
Ivan Duque
claridad,
explained
estamos
very clearly that in
implementando el
Colombia,
acuerdo
we are
celebrado con
implementing
las FARC, donde
the
se
agreement we
definieron
established with the
51
FARC.
indicadores
That
que
agreement
tienen una
defined
trazabilidad
51
permanente.
indicators that
Y
are
dentro de
measured
estos 51
continuously.
indicadores, ya el
These 51
60%
indicators,
se
well,
han
50%
implementado
of those have already
totalmente, han
been
cumplido
fully
con su
implemented.
propósito. Se han
The
dedicado
goal of
recursos
these
importantes a los
indicators have been
proyectos
reached.
productivos de las
Significant
mujeres. En
resources
un
have been devoted to
37% de los
women-related
casos
projects.
de las mujeres víctimas, también vemos nosotros que han sido
Often,
beneficiarias de hectáreas
women
formalizadas para que a través
affected
de
by
esta adjudicación de
conflict-related
tierras
violence
puedan
have
entonces también
received title
desarrollar sus
deeds to
proyectos
land
productivos.
so that
Y en el
they can
caso de
develop
nuestro
their
país, que
productive
ha sufrido
projects.
tanto
And our
por el
country
narcotráfico,
has
como
suffered
también lo
a
han
great
sufrido
deal as a
otros
result
países
of drug
sobre los cuales
trafficking.
obviamente no existe
Of
esa
course,
referencia
other countries
permanente.
have
En nuestro
suffered
caso
from that
fueron
scourge.
33.827 personas
Some
registradas
33,000
como
people
víctimas
in
del
our country
delito de
have been
violencia
recorded
sexual,
as
y de esas
victims of
33.000
sexual
son
violence, and
30.546
30,000 of
mujeres, es
these,
decir, el
or thereabouts, are
90%,
women.
lo cual nos
90%
reafirma
of the
que sí
siempre
of
la
sexual
mujer
violence in
es
our
la que
country
lleva
are women,
desafortunadamente la peor
and that
parte en
means
esto. Por
that
esa
they
razón,
really are the
buena
primary
parte de la
victims of
reparación está en
sexual violence in
medidas
our
de
country,
tipo
and
económico, pero
consequently,
también con
economic
acompañamiento
and other forms of
psicológico a las
redress is
mujeres.
often
Y en
devoted
cuanto a la
to women.
justicia, que es un elemento muy
Regarding
importante, quiero
justice, which is
señalar que
very
en el caso de
important, I want to
Colombia,
indicate that
la
where Colombia
Fiscalía
is
ha
concerned,
creado
the
un
Attorney
cuerpo
General has
especial de
created
fiscales
a specialized
especializados
body
en la
of
violencia
attorneys
sexual,
specialized in
fiscales
sexual
que
violence,
tienen toda la
attorneys,
formación especial
prosecutors that
justamente
have a wealth
para
of
trabajar en
training
los temas de violencia de
in
género y
working
practicar
on
todas las
sexual
pruebas
violence and
sin
gender-based violence
revictimizar
issues.
nuevamente a la
And
mujer o a la
that means
persona
that they
que
can
haya
provide
sufrido esta
justice without
violencia, porque también sabemos
re-traumatizing
que
female victims of
desafortunadamente
sexual
la han
violence,
sufrido los
because
hombres. En
but
nuestro
also
país,
we know
entre otras
women have
cosas, hemos tomado
unfortunately suffered
medidas
from the
y el
scourge too.
presidente
We
Iván
are
Duque
taking
por
measures in
primera
that
vez
regard.
hizo
Iván
un
Duque, for the
Consejo de
first
Seguridad
time,
Nacional
at
con el comandante del
convened a National
ejército, con
Security
todo
Council
el
with the
director de la
Army
Policía
Chief of Staff
Nacional,
and with the
con la
Directors of
Fiscalía, con el
National
Defensor del
National
Pueblo,
Police,
para
with
hacer un
the
análisis de
Ombudsman,
cómo
and
está
that
el tema
meeting
de la
analysed
seguridad
where things
y
stood
el
in terms of
riesgo de violencia
security and
sexual
the
contra las
risk of
mujeres.
sexual
Y a
violence being
partir de esa
perpetrated against
experiencia
women.
hemos
And that
desarrollado
meeting
ya en el
prompted us to
70% de los municipios de Colombia
ensure that
un
in
mecanismo
70% of our
semejante en
municipal
donde
authorities
los
we're developing a
representantes de la
similar
fuerza
mechanism
pública,
where
los
the
fiscales
representative
están
of public bodies
permanentemente
and
trabajando
prosecutors are
para
permanently
identificar
working
aquellos
to
casos y denuncias
identify
y obviamente
cases of
asegurar que no
sexual
haya
violence and to
impunidad en los
ensure that
casos
there
de
is no
violencia sexual
impunity when it comes
contra las
to
mujeres.
sexual
De
violence
tal manera
perpetrated
que
against
estas
women.
recomendaciones las recogemos
These
y repito, buena
recommendations
parte
are
de estas
ones to take due
recomendaciones ya
note
las
of,
está cumpliendo
but I would say that a number of the
Colombia por su
recommendations that
propia
have been issued are already being
iniciativa, pero nos
fulfilled and met
parece
by
muy
Colombia on its
importante
own initiative,
realmente
but it is
fortalecer
crucially
entonces las
important to
recomendaciones de
strengthen
parte del Consejo de
recommendations
Seguridad
issued
para
by
que
the
no
Security
se sigan
Council
otorgando
so that we
créditos
don't
a aquellos
continue granting
países donde
money
no hay
and
toda una
loans
agenda
to
robusta,
countries where there
orientada a
isn't a
garantizar
robust
la equidad
agenda
de
in
género
place
y
designed to
acabar la
guarantee gender
violencia
equality
contra las
and to
mujeres y
eradicate
especialmente
sexual
la
violence
violencia
against women
derivada de los
and
conflictos. Es muy
especially
importante la
conflict-related
participación de
sexual
las mujeres
violence.
en la
That
fuerza
financing
pública.
point is very
Nosotros
important.
nos hemos
Women must
dedicado a
participate
promover
in
también la
public
mayor
bodies.
participación,
We've
tanto
also
como oficiales de
devoted our
alto
energies
rango,
to
pero
ensuring
también
that
mujeres
women
que estén
participate
como soldados. Esta
as
mañana en las
soldiers,
exposiciones, pues obviamente
but
es muy
also that they have
doloroso
senior
oír que
leadership
las soldados
positions.
de
It's
Eritrea,
very
ellas
painful to
mismas
hear that
protagonicen
soldiers
entonces
in
ese
Eritrea,
tipo de violencia,
female
siendo
soldiers in Eritrea, are often the
humillando a los hombres.
perpetrators
Aquí no
of
puede haber nadie
sexual
que se
violence.
pueda sentir validado
And
para ejercer ningún tipo de violencia
it's
sexual contra
tragic because
otros
no one can feel that they've
durante
got
el
any right
conflicto.
to
El
perpetrate
reporte se
sexual
refiere a
violence against
18
someone else in
países.
conflict.
Yo
The
me temo que son
report
muchos
refers
más
to
los
18
países que no están
countries, the Secretary
incluidos
General's
en
report,
este
but I fear
reporte,
that
donde
many other
permanentemente
countries
estamos
are
viendo
affected by
casos
sexual
de
violence
violencia
that aren't
sexual para
mentioned.
mostrar la dominación de
And
un grupo sobre otro, o
sexual
también para
violence in all of
reducir
these
la
countries is being
capacidad
used to
de
demonstrate the
acción y
supremacy of
reducir la
one group over
voluntad
another.
de
It's
determinados
also being
sectores de la
used to
población
dull
para
the will
obviamente
of
obligarlos
many
en
people in
determinado
societies
sentido.
to
Entonces,
speak
muy
out or
importante
to
este trabajo,
participate
lo
in public
agradecemos
life. So
muchísimo y
your work is
Colombia
very important.
ofrece toda su
My deep
cooperación también
gratitude
en
to you,
aquellos
and we are
temas en
ready and
donde hemos
willing to
venido
fully cooperate
desarrollando
with
iniciativas
you on
propias,
those
entre
issues where
otras
we've
cosas,
been
llevar
spearheading
la
our own
justicia
initiatives.
a las zonas rurales
And
remotas
for
para
example,
que sea la
particularly important is
justicia la que va a
bringing
buscar
justice to
en la
remote
casa de las
rural
mujeres
areas.
y no esperar hasta que las
We need
mujeres
to go to
algún día
women's
puedan
houses
salir
and
de
not
su hogar
waiting for
a
women to
buscar
be able to
esa
leave their
justicia.
homes one day
Muchas
in search
gracias,
of
señor
justice. That's where
presidente,
we've
por
been
su
working, for example, and we'd
liderazgo
be
y
happy
por
to cooperate
supuesto
with you.
con todo el
Thank you for your
compromiso de
leadership. You
trabajar
have the
siempre
full
desde
commitment of
Colombia en
Colombia
estos temas, no
to
solamente
working
para
on
la
these issues,
implementación del
not
acuerdo
only when it
por
comes
el
to
conflicto en nuestro
implementing
país, sino
the
porque la
final
voz
agreement
sobre este
that
tema
dealt with
no
the
se
conflict
calle
in
nunca.
our country,
Gracias.
but our commitment to ensuring this
I
topic
thank Her
doesn't fall
Excellency
off our
Ms.
agenda. Thank
Ramirez
you.
for her statements. Now, let me remind all speakers to limit their statements to no more than 4 minutes. We are running tight with time, but I now give the floor to the representative of Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Distinguished colleagues, allow me at the outset to congratulate you on the UK's presidency of the United Nations Security Council for the month of April. And thank you for convening this timely meeting to discuss conflict-related sexual violence. I would like to thank the distinguished briefers for their invaluable service to the cause of combating conflict-related sexual violence and their contribution to the debate today. Mr. President, COVID-19 has exacerbated violence against women and girls, especially those in conflict. Conflict-related sexual violence is a tactic used often to target civilians, inflicting long-term trauma and humiliation, fracturing families and the social fabric, triggering displacement, and fueling armed actors' activities. Throughout the years, the role of peacekeeping missions has evolved and been modernized to adapt to new emerging challenges, such as the CRSV. A coordinated and comprehensive approach across civilian, military, and police components, from strategic to operational levels, is critical to peacekeeping missions to effectively prevent and respond to CRSV in the performance of their mandates. Training, mainstreaming policies against CRSV, enhancing monitoring and reporting mechanisms, and advocacy and raising awareness are crucial elements in any successful strategy to combat CRSV. Distinguished colleagues, Jordan, a host country to millions of refugees, had its already scarce resources strained. Nonetheless, through its response plan, we carried numerous outreach activities that have the objective of raising awareness, particularly among young people, to change social norms and promote gender equality, with a particular focus on the prevention of child marriage and ending sexual and gender-based violence. In addition, Jordan's YPS 2250 National Coalition has collaborated with UNFPA to organize an online interactive session to mobilize young people and representatives of youth organizations and networks on CRSV and discuss the impact of sexual violence on the lives of young people and their communities, as well as the effective tools to combat the phenomena. Gender-responsive security sector reforms remain crucial for the fulfillment of our mission to eliminate CRSV. As part of Jordan's National Action Plan, we managed to integrate gender-responsive training into the security sector. Mr. President, we must ensure that existing UN, international, and national mechanisms to combat sexual violence are supported and provided with the needed resources to support survivors and prevent future tragedies. Perpetrators of violence, whether state or non-state actors, must also be held responsible for their acts. States should harmonize their legislation to criminalize CRSV under the national laws and remove any procedural impediments for prosecution of the crimes, including forms of immunity like immunity ratione materia. CRSV must not be seen as an inevitable byproduct of the process. Effective implementation of criminal responsibility, criminal accountability, and international responsibility is an important deterrent for the commission of the crime. The well-being of survivors should be our focus in the efforts to reducing and preventing sexual violence, ensuring equal access to medical care and psychological support for all sexual violence survivors during conflict and in post-conflict situations is an integral part of the process. Distinguished colleagues, now is the moment to enhance our joint efforts to eliminate sexual violence in conflicts. We have a second chance to reset the rhythm in our endeavors to end conflicts around the world and build back better for our future generations, where every individual around the world would be able to realize their full potential. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Jordan for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Mr. President, I begin by thanking the UK for organising this open debate and today's briefers for enriching the discussion with their personal experiences and insights. Malta aligns itself with the statements to be delivered by the European Union and the group of Friends of Women, Peace and Security and the LGBTI core group, and would like to make some additional remarks in its national capacity. Mr. President, sexual violence and rape are terrifying weapons of war aimed at humiliating and stigmatizing helpless civilians. As members of the international community, we must strive to prevent these crimes, redouble our efforts to hold perpetrators accountable, and ensure that we support survivors. We must reject the notion that sexual violence and rape are unfortunate but inevitable consequences of war. They are not. They are war crimes. They are a breach of international law and must be treated as such. In Ukraine, reports of rape continue to increase. Several women and girls have recounted the sexual violence and abuse that they have suffered at the hands of Russian soldiers. I commend the courage of the many women who are sharing the chilling accounts of rape and other forms of sexual violence. What we are hearing by word of mouth, especially of survivors, is horrific. We cannot be silent in the face of such atrocities. Neither can we forget what has happened and continues to happen in other parts of the world. In Syria, Yemen, South Sudan, Nigeria, Democratic Republic of Congo, Afghanistan, Iraq, Ethiopia, Myanmar, Libya, and other places. Malta is concerned that children, particularly girls, are vulnerable to sexual violence at or on their way to school. We call on all parties to conflict to end and prevent sexual violence against children. Mr. President, conflict-related sexual violence is equally traumatizing yet different in nuance for women, girls, men, boys, and people with diverse sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression and sex characteristics. Justice and accountability must be crucial parts of our response, and more awareness is needed to promote accountability. Survivors must be kept at the center of our efforts. They must have access to resources to counter the multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination they face, while a more gendered psychological and medical support should be ensured. Special Representative Patton has once again pointed out to the fear and stigma that survivors face. Malta fully supports the mandate of the SRSG and commends the important work of her office. It is equally important for women and girls in all the diversity to enjoy full, equal, and meaningful participation and leadership at all levels of decision-making, as outlined in Security Council Resolution 1325. Providing all survivors with access to a holistic model of care, covering medical, psychological, legal, and socioeconomic needs, is a concrete way to empower women towards demanding their rights and creating change both within their countries and globally. There can be no impunity for those who violate human rights law and international humanitarian law. The ICC can contribute to the fight against conflict-related sexual violence by developing and consolidating a gender-responsive legal framework and jurisprudence. The capacity of governments, judiciary, police, military, and civil society should be further built to gather evidence and strengthen prosecutions. Training to military and police personnel, peacekeepers, grassroots organizations, and human rights defenders on sexual violence issues remains essential. In conclusion, by adopting a holistic approach, we need to save and protect, but also we hope that victims, given all the support for their recovery, are transformed into empowered survivors and agents of change within their communities. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for her statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Canada.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I speak on behalf of 64 member states of the Group of Friends of Women, Peace and Security. Our group is profoundly concerned by the persistent and widespread use of sexual violence with impunity by state and non-state actors in a great many conflicts around the world. The list of these conflicts is long, Mr. President, and it's been mentioned by several, including in the Secretary General's report. I think it's important that we bear them all in mind. I appreciated the comments from my colleague from Malta with respect to the situation in Ukraine. And we need to understand that the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has spoken of possible war crimes, breaches of international humanitarian law, and serious violations of international human rights laws. We strongly support the Secretary General's call for an immediate independent investigation of the conduct of all those involved in the conflict. Mr. President, we call on all parties in all conflict situations to immediately cease all forms of sexual violence consistent with international law and with resolutions of the Security Council. Those responsible for such heinous acts must be held to account by national justice, or, where that is not possible, international justice. Regrettably, for many victims and survivors, access to justice, remedies, and reparation is non-existent or painfully slow. UN member states must fight impunity through strengthening the rule of law. Our group strongly encourages the Security Council to incorporate and apply sexual violence as a designation criterion in UN sanctioned regimes. We must redouble our efforts to dismantle all barriers that hinder survivors from safely reporting sexual violence and from accessing essential services, which include sexual and reproductive health care services, victim advocacy, mental health and psychosocial support, and legal services. We also reiterate the importance of ensuring universal access to sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights, as has been agreed in accordance with the Program of Action of the International Conference on Population and Development, as well as the Beijing Platform for Action. We call on all parties to ensure a safe and enabling environment for civil society, including women peace builders, women human rights defenders, to carry out their important work free of intimidation, free from violence, and free from reprisals. Mr. President, member states must invest in tackling the root causes of conflict-related violence. Prevention starts, we believe, with a commitment, first of all and foremost, to gender equality, with the empowerment of women and girls in diverse situations and conditions, the protection and promotion of human rights, and women's full, equal, and meaningful participation and leadership at all levels of decision-making. We encourage the Council to ensure that country mandates emphasize the prevention of conflict-related sexual violence and strengthen early warning systems through the deployment of women's protection advisors. Finally, it is critical that survivors remain at the heart of all of our efforts. We must recognize that survivors have different needs and may face multiple intersecting forms of discrimination. We must ensure that their rights are respected, that they're treated with dignity, that they're able to access justice, and that they can safely, fully, and meaningfully participate in decision-making at all levels. Monsieur le Président, permettez-moi brièvement également de dire quelques mots au nom de mon pays, Canada. Nous sommes convaincus qu'il faut continuer d'appuyer les travaux de la Cour pénale internationale et lorsque la Cour n'a pas compétence, nous allons continuer d'explorer les moyens d'assurer la responsabilité de ces crimes. Enfin, les expériences de tous les survivants, y compris la communauté LGBTI, nous rappellent la nécessité de faire une chose simplement, et c'est d'écouter. Notre travail consiste à les aider à reconstruire leur vie, à restaurer leur dignité, et à trouver la justice. Mr. President, if I may, just one last moment, if I could. I had the opportunity to serve as the Prime Minister's Special Envoy to Myanmar and to Bangladesh. I came to the camp in Cox's Bazar 3 or 4 weeks after the forcible deportation of nearly 1 million people, many of them women and girls, most of them women and girls. I had the opportunity to speak to a great many women who had been the victims of sexual violence. Sexual violence is not about sex. It's about power, and it's about violence, and it's about the abuse of patriarchal power. The stories that I heard have been repeated, and luckily, fortunately, people have been able to tell them to a great many people who have gathered evidence and who are gathering evidence and presenting this evidence. Tragically, this experience is going to have to be repeated in country after country after country. We have to take every possible step to stop this terrible abuse. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Canada for his statements. There are still a number of speakers remaining on my list for this meeting, so I intend, with the concurrence of members of the Council, to suspend the meeting until 3 p.m. And I also thank the interpreters for keeping going until this time. The meeting is suspended.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your time.
he had asked me, he said, "Can I use your mic?" I was like, "Absolutely," and I had it ready, but then the guy who showed over so quickly that I said, "Oh, I'm fine." Okay. Yeah, you did great. Thanks. I wasn't expecting translation. Yeah, me too. Like, so once in a while, just play by ear. Anybody else? Now we just wait. We don't have a seat. Yeah, just wait. So far, so good. Otherwise, they would call me. They just asked me to come and figure it out. Yeah. Seems like everything's getting worse. Okay, we can go downstairs now. Leave everything here? Yeah, because they're gonna have an afternoon meeting. That's right.